The origins of genies and so-called elemental lords in Dungeons & Dragons lie at the intersection of real-world myth and early fantasy gaming innovation. Genies, powerful spirits bound to the elements, trace back to ancient Arabian and Islamic folklore, most famously 1001 Nights, wherein Djinn or Jinn are supernatural beings capable of granting wishes and reshaping reality. These tales of wish-granting spirits captivated Western audiences and heavily informed fantasy literature and media through the 20th century. By the 1970s, sword and sorcery games were drawing on global mythic archetypes, and the genie's exotic mystique made it a prime candidate for inclusion in the emerging fantasy role-playing genre. Early D&D co-creator Gary Gygax had a penchant for incorporating diverse mythologies, from Greek and Norse to Middle Eastern, into the game's bestiary. In the case of Genies, Gygax and fellow designers looked to folklore for inspiration, but adapted those concepts to fit D&D's unique multiverse of elemental planes. Beyond folklore, literary fantasy also played a role. Appendix N of the Dungeon Master's Guide, 1979, cites inspirational authors like Jack Vance, whose Dying Earth stories feature capricious summoned entities, the Sanderstins, not unlike genies, and Michael Moorcock, whose novels include powerful elemental royalty. These sources seeded the idea of elemental beings with personalities and vast powers. Early D&D's elemental creatures were initially simple forces of nature, fire elementals, air elementals, etc. But the notion of distinct rulers or nobility among elemental beings grew as the game evolved. Gygax's world-building in the Greyhawk campaign alluded to enigmatic powers like the Elder Elemental God, hinting that elemental forces could have deity-like patrons, a concept that laid groundwork for later Elemental Lords. Meanwhile, the creators of D&D were conscious of popular depictions of genies in media, from the comically tame genie in I Dream of Genie to sinister Djinn in fantasy pulp, and they aimed to craft D&D genies as formidable otherworldly beings rather than cartoon caricatures. Early design notes show the team explicitly distancing D&D genies from the whimsical wish-granters of children's tales, positioning them instead as dangerous, freedom-loving creatures of the inner planes. The Elemental Lords, on the other hand, were a more original invention of the game designers. These beings, later termed Archomentals, have no one single real-world mythic counterpart, but draw on the idea of personified elemental forces found in sources like the occult writings of Paracelsus, for example Undines, salamanders, and the titanic elemental warlords of fantasy fiction. As game designer Louis Pulsifer later recounted, he created the first elemental princes just for the heck of it, in the same spirit as D&D's demon princes, to serve as powerful boss monsters embodying the raw might of fire, air, water, and earth. In short, the concept of genies in D&D was directly inspired by myth and legend, whereas the concept of elemental lords developed from the game's internal logic. If demons rule the abyss and devils rule the hells, why shouldn't mighty elemental entities rule the seas of fire and sky? This melding of mythological inspiration with original design would characterize D&D's genies and elemental lords from their inception onward. Genies debuted at the very dawn of D&D. In the original Dungeons & Dragons White Box set, 1974, the Three Little Brown Books, authored by Gygax and Dave Arneson, the monsters booklet introduced both the Djinn and the Efreet as creatures for players to encounter. These entries mark the very first appearance of genies in the game, predating the coining of any formal genie category. The D&D Djinn, singular genie, was described as an aerial creature, explicitly not having the powers typically credited to them in fairy tales. In other words, Gygax cautioned players from the start that his Djinn wouldn't be casually handing out unlimited wishes. Instead, the original Genie possessed a suite of other magical abilities. They could fly at great speed, assume gaseous form or invisibility at will, create nutritious food and drink, and even conjure permanent objects made of wood or cloth, though metal items they created would only last a short time, with Djinn gold vanishing after a day. They could also generate illusions and raise a small whirlwind in battle. This portrayal established the Genie as powerful and versatile, if not an omnipotent wish-granter. The Efreet, Efreeti in singular form, likewise made its first appearance in the 1974 rules. Modelled on the fiery evil Efreet of Arabic lore, D&D's Efreet were described as native to the elemental plane of fire, with their fabled home, the city of Brass, an alluring drop of lore that hinted at a grandiose extraplanar metropolis. The Efreet were stated to be enemies of the Djinn and generally of chaotic, evil temperament. They shared many of the Djinn's abilities, flight, invisibility, etc., but with a fiery twist. Efreet could create walls of flame and turn themselves into incendiaries, effectively becoming living fire. One evocative detail in the original entry said an Efreeti will serve for 1001 days, if magically bound, a nod to the 1001 nights motif of long-term servitude and one of the few hints of wish-granting behavior. Notably, even in those early rules, there was no mention of an Efreet granting a wish spell freely. The concept of obtaining wishes from genies was handled via magical items, like rings of wishes, rather than inherent genie powers. This was likely a balance choice by Gygax, who feared that unlimited wishes would screw with the game's challenge. Indeed, a famous passage in the 1974 rules advises dungeon masters to be extremely cautious with wish-granting magic, providing examples of how overly greedy wishes might backfire, such as the referee trapping a wishmonger in a time loop or twisting a wish for a powerful item into a curse. In short, the first genies in D&D set a template: fantastical elemental beings with immense but not game-breaking powers, whose legendary wish abilities were present in spirit but limited in practice. It's worth noting that the term genie itself did not initially appear as a monster classification in the 1974 set. The game spoke of Djinn and Efreet separately, treating them almost like unique species. Nevertheless, these creatures were directly lifted from myth onto the tabletop, bringing with them the romance of Arabian deserts and brass lamps. Early players encountering a Genie or Efreeti in the 1970s would recognize them from folklore, but quickly learn that D&D's genies had their own distinct behavior and limitations. The impact of these first appearances was significant. The Efreeti on the cover of the Dungeon Master's Guide, 1979, became one of D&D's most iconic images, underscoring how central these creatures were to the game's sense of wonder. That cover painting by David C. Sutherland III shows a towering red Efreet locked in combat with adventurers while the city of Brass hovers in the fiery sky behind, a tableau that visually cemented the Efreet's place in D&D lore. Thus, by the end of D&D's first incarnation, the original D&D and early advanced D&D period, genies were firmly established as exotic adversaries or potential allies, linking the mundane world of adventurers to the scintillating realms of elemental fire and air. If genies were present from the game's inception, Elemental Lords took a bit longer to coalesce in D&D's cosmology. The earliest glimmers came through adventure scenarios rather than core rules. In 1976, the supplement Eldritch Wizardry introduced powerful demon princes, planting the idea that each planar sphere of existence could have ruling entities. Gary Gygax's home campaign in Greyhawk featured the Elder Elemental Eye, an enigmatic dark power with elemental cults, which later modules hinted was a guise of the chained evil god Tharizdun. While not an elemental lord per se, the Elder Elemental Eye set the stage for elemental cults and mighty elemental evils. The first true named elemental powers to appear were the Princes of Elemental Evil, a band of malign elemental rulers devised by designer Louis Pulsifer in the late 1970s. These beings did not feature in the initial 1974 rules, but their concept was foreshadowed by the idea that elemental creatures might have hierarchies and princes, analogous to devils and demons. In summary, the first appearance of genies in D&D dates to 1974's inaugural set, Djinn and Efreet, bringing legendary Middle Eastern spirits into fantasy gaming, whereas the seeds of the Elemental Lords were sown in early fan-created content and would fully sprout in the published game a few years later, heralding a new pantheon of elemental royalty. The late 1970s and 1980s marked D&D's first major evolution with Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, 1st edition. And during this era, genies flourished from a pair of monsters into a whole family of elemental beings. In 1977, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons premiered with the Monster Manual, the first hardcover bestiary by Gary Gygax. Both the Genie and Efreet were included among AD&D's standard creatures. Gygax's Monster Manual entries largely carried forward the original descriptions. The Genie remained a powerful air spirit of neutral alignment, tending toward good, and the Efreet a cruel fire dweller of neutral evil tendency. At this point, the word genie still wasn't used as a formal category. The Monster Manual simply listed Genie and Efreet alphabetically. Even so, each entry acknowledged the other, noting that Efreet and Djinn were age-old enemies. This implicitly grouped them as related species. Illustrations in the Monster Manual depicted the Genie as a turbaned, muscular humanoid emerging from a cloud, and the Efreet as a horned, demonic figure wreathed in flame. Imagery clearly drawn from mythic and pulp fantasy conventions. One subtle expansion in AD&D was that Efreet could now grant limited wishes. The Dungeon Master's Guide, 1979, included an item called the Efreet Bottle, which when opened would release an Efreet capable of granting 3 wishes to the one who freed it. This magical item essentially canonized the idea of an Efreet as a wish granter, albeit under controlled conditions. The Efreet of the bottle was magically compelled into service and disappeared after granting 3 wishes. Gygax thus found a way to satisfy folklore, the 3 wishes trope, while maintaining game balance. The Efreet was bound and limited. Outside of such items, though, free-roaming Efreet in AD&D were not handing out wishes on a whim. They remained adversaries to fight or bargain with, often attempting to mislead or enslave those who tried to command them. A major development of Era 1 was the introduction of more types of genies. In the pages of Dragon magazine, Gygax began previewing new creatures before their hardcover publication. Notably, Dragon magazine number 66, October 1982, featured an article in Gygax's Featured Creatures series that unveiled 3 new genie races: the Dao, Marid, and Jann. This was a significant expansion of the genie concept. In real-world myth, Dao are not present. The Dao were an original creation by Gygax to fill the elemental earth niche. Marids were drawn from Arabic lore, where Marid, meaning rebellious, refers to powerful Djinn often associated with the open seas. Jann, plural Janni in Gygax's initial terminology, were conceived as lesser genies composed of all 4 elements, loosely inspired by folklore of desert-dwelling Djinn. Gygax's impetus was the classic 4-element schema. Since air and fire had genies, water and earth must too. Indeed, as one commentator observed, it appears Gygax shoehorned Marids into the Genies of Water role and made up the Tao from scratch to complete the elemental quartet. The Dragon No. 66 article, edited by Kim Mohan, provided full D&D stats and descriptions for these new genies, effectively treating it as a sneak preview for the upcoming Monster Manual 2.1 quirky detail. Gygax originally used Jann as singular and Janni as plural, but this would later be standardized to Janni, singular pronounced Ja-ni, and Jann, plural, in 2nd edition. The expanded Genie roster soon found its way into game products. In late 1982, the adventure module The Lost Caverns of Tsoj-Canth was released, and it included the Tao and Marid in its bestiary appendix. Tsoj-Canth was one of Gygax's last Greyhawk adventures and served as a testing ground for new monsters. The module's inclusion of earth and water genies signaled that players could now encounter genies of all 4 elements in play. Shortly after, the hardcover Monster Manual 2, 1983, compiled these creatures officially. It contained entries for Tao, Genie, Efreet, Jann, and Marid, grouping them under the umbrella of genies. In Monster Manual 2, Gygax explicitly defined genies, geniekind, as a class of elemental humanoids with several sub-races. The text explained their hierarchy. The Jann were the weakest of the elemental humanoids, being of mixed elemental heritage and thus bound mostly to the prime material plane. In contrast, the Tao, Djinn, Efreet, and Marid each hailed from a pure elemental plane and were more powerful in their own realms. Notably, MM2 gave each genie type a unique cultural flavor. The Tao were depicted as cruel slavers from the plane of earth, coveting precious metals and gems. The Marid were mighty, proud denizens of the plane of water, often portraying themselves as sultans and shahs of the deep. The Djinn of air were described as relatively benevolent and free-spirited, with a dislike for confinement. And the Efreet of fire were malevolent tyrants, residing in the majestic city of brass. Each had a leader mentioned in passing, for example, the Great Khan of the Tao or the Padishah of the Marids, sowing seeds for later lore developments. The mechanical design in 1st edition AD&D balanced these genies against each other. Tao and Djinn were roughly equivalent in power, Marid were the strongest, boasting the highest hit dice and abilities, and Jann the weak established. All of them could grant a limited wish, a minor wish spell, in the AD&D rules, but only under specific circumstances. For instance, a genie might be compelled through magic, or might reward characters sparingly. This kept the wish economy under control, while still letting genies feel magical. Player strategies in 1st edition sometimes involved trapping a genie to extract its one wish, but dungeon masters were armed with the lore that genies deeply resented such imprisonment and would twist wishes or seek vengeance if coerced. Meanwhile, this era also introduced the noble genies and genie society through storytelling in adventure modules. TSR's 1982 to 1983 Desert of Desolation trilogy, modules Pharaoh, Oasis of the White Palm, Lost Tomb of Martek, featured ancient Egyptian and Arabian-themed scenarios that included genie non-player characters. In Module Pharaoh, 1982, by Tracy Hickman, adventurers encounter the Pasha of an Efreet, a powerful Efreet noble, as well as a magical ring linked to genie servitude. In the sequel Oasis of the White Palm, 1983, an ancient temple houses Ereldoth, vizier to the Caliph of the Djinn, indicating that the Djinn, too, had a ruling caliph in D&D's cosmology. These story elements painted a picture of a grand genie civilization in the background, caliphs, sultans, khans, and viziers scheming in opulent courts on the elemental planes. Such lore was only sketched in first edition, but it laid the foundation for what would later blossom into fully realized genie cultures. Parallel to genie development, Elemental Lords made their formal debut in this era as well, specifically the Princes of Elemental Evil. In 1981, TSR's Fiend Folio was published, a compilation of monsters from the British gaming magazine White Dwarf and other sources, edited by Don Turnbull. Among its entries were the arch-villains Imix, Ogrémoch, Jann, Olhydra, and Cryonax, each identified as a prince of elemental evil for fire, earth, air, water, and, in Cryonax's case, cold, para-elemental ice. These were the game's first Archomentals, though that term wasn't coined until later. Imix, for example, is described as the prince of evil fire creatures, a mighty being embodying flame. He was actually created by contributor Louis Pulsifer, who invented the elemental princes as analogues to the demon princes of the abyss. Pulsifer has noted that he did not use them in his own campaigns. His players never reached levels high enough to challenge such foes, but he submitted them to TSR almost as a thought experiment. What would a demon lord level threat look like if based on elemental fury instead of fiendish sin? The Fiend Folio entries gave each Prince of Evil a physical form and combat abilities. Imix appeared as a great humanoid shaped out of fire, hurling flame and commanding fire elementals. Ogrémoch was a hulking brute of living stone and soil. Jann was an invisible vortex with tremendous control over winds. Olhydra, a sentient wave or blob of water, and Cryonax, a bizarre tentacled polar monstrosity of ice. These villains were of exceptional power, meant to test the mettle of the highest level parties. They also each ruled fantastical domains on their respective planes, Imix in a volcano citadel, Ogrémoch in a moving mountain fortress, etc. The Fiend Folio did not elaborate much on their personalities beyond pure malevolence, but it firmly placed them in the D&D cosmology as counterparts to Orcus or Demogorgon, elemental tyrants to be feared. It's interesting that these elemental lords emerged first on the evil side. AD&D. First edition did not originally list any benevolent elemental rulers. Heroes of good alignment dealing with the elemental planes typically sought aid from higher-order elementals or gods instead. The idea of good Archomentals, sometimes dubbed Princes of Elemental Good, would only be explored later in the second edition Planescape setting. But even in first edition, some hints existed. The Dungeon Master's Guide, 1979, contained a tantalizing snippet in its famed Appendix on the planes. It described the elemental planes and mentioned the city of Brass on the plane of fire, as well as the Wind Dukes of Akie, ancient lawful air elementals who fought chaos, an allusion to a famous Greyhawk backstory. Those Wind Dukes weren't genies, but they illustrated that the notion of elemental nobility allies was present. And in Gygax's module, The Temple of Elemental Evil, T1-4, published 1985, while the ultimate villain is the demoness Zugtmoy, the temple's lesser sanctums and magical nodes contained references to the princes of elemental evil, Imix and his brethren. The node of fire, for instance, was linked to Imix's power, although players in the 1985 module did not directly meet Imix. They encountered an altar or gate through which his influence seeped. This foreshadowed that the princes themselves could be adversaries in the future. Indeed, a few years earlier, in 1982, Frank Mentzer had written The Egg of the Phoenix, an RPGA tournament module in which one scenario pitted the players against Imix as a major antagonist. Such appearances were rare and typically in high-level or special event modules, but they cemented Imix's infamy among devoted fans. By the end of AD&D First Edition's era, the tapestry of genies and elemental lords had grown rich. Players could encounter genial Djinn, who conjure banquets out of thin air, or malevolent Dao dragging victims into the earth. They heard whispers of a great caliph of the Djinn or a sultan of the Efreet, ruling over fantastical cities of elemental splendor. And they learned to fear names like Imix, an elemental prince so fearsome that wise adventurers might flee at the mere glimpse of his fiery form. The First Edition era had successfully taken the seed of 1974's two Genies and grown it into a small pantheon of elemental creatures that would only expand in subsequent editions. The transition to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons' Second Edition in 1989 ushered in an era of deep world-building and cultural exploration for Genies and Elemental Lords. Under lead designer David Zeb Cook and others, Second Edition placed greater emphasis on story, mythology, and the integration of monsters into settings. Genies benefited enormously from this approach, becoming more than just encounter statistics. They were given societies, leaders, and roles in various campaign worlds. In 1989, the launch of Second Edition reintroduced the core 5 Genie races in the new Monstrous Compendium loose-leaf format. Monstrous Compendium Volume 1, 1989, contained the Genie, Efreet, and Dao entries, while Volume 2, 1989, included the Jann and Marid, all grouped under the category Genie. These compendium entries consolidated and clarified Genie lore. They confirmed that all 5 types are collectively Genie kind, native to the inner planes, and generally do not get along, especially Djinn versus Efreet, Dao trading grudgingly with Efreet, etc. The Second Edition Monstrous Manual, 1993, later compiled these entries, adding richer descriptions. For example, the Monstrous Manual describes how Efreet appear massive and solid, with red or black skin that was always burning, often mistaken for devils by the uninitiated. It details the relations. Efreet oppress fire elementals and enslave others. Djinn and Efreet are bitter enemies engaged in numerous battles. Dao and Efreet maintain a wary trade relationship, earth for fire, raw gems for forged goods, and most Genies see mortals as either pawns or curiosities. The quirks of each race were maintained. Djinn stayed relatively friendly and could create nourishing food, drink. Efreet remained cruel and could still grant up to 3 wishes to non-Genies, now explicitly stated as a spell-like ability usable once per day in Second Edition rules. Dao were greedy and malign, able to pass wall through earth and stone. Marids were chaotic and the most powerful Genie type, able to control water and weather. And Jann were the weakest but most human-friendly, often dwelling on the material plane as desert nomads. What truly set Second Edition apart was the development of Genie culture and nobility, especially through the campaign settings. In 1992, TSR released the Al-Qadim setting, an Arabian Nights-inspired world, Zakhara, the land of fate, that fully embraced Genies in its lore. Al-Qadim's design, by Jeff Grubb and others, treated Genies as integral to the cosmos and daily life of its people. The monstrous compendium Al-Qadim Appendix, 1992, exploded the Genie roster with a host of new subtypes. It introduced the concept of noble Genies. Each of the 4 elemental Genie races has a singular ruler of immense power. The great Khan of the Dao, the great Caliph of the Djinn, the Sultan of the Efreet, and the Padishah of the Marids, as well as a court of noble Genies who serve them. These noble Genies were essentially higher hit die versions with additional magic. For instance, the great Khan of the Dao, Kabril Ali al-Sara al-Zalazil in Zakhara's lore, was said to rule the sprawling underground empire of the Dao in the Great Dismal Delve, and he could command numerous lesser Dao. The great Caliph of the Djinn dwelled in the citadel of ice and steel, a shining palace of clouds and ice on the plain of air. The Sultan of the Efreet, perhaps the most famous noble genie, sat on the charcoal throne in the fabled city of brass, from which he ruled all Efreet kind, with an iron fist and an ever-scheming vizier at his side. The great Padishah of the Marids, a title held by a mighty married queen in Al-Qadim lore, Kalbari al-Durat al-Amwaj ibn Jari, held court in the citadel of 10,000 pearls beneath the waves. Each of these rulers was given personality and context. Padishah Kalbari was described as wise and just for a marid, but fiercely proud, capable of detecting any lie spoken in her presence. The Efreet Sultan was cruel and domineering, with a harem of Efreeti nobles and a city where even other genies tread carefully. The Dao Khan was slothful and greedy, obsessed with hoarding wealth and slaves. Al-Qadim's sourcebooks and adventures like City of Delights and Assassin Mountain 1993 fleshed out genie politics. Genie nobles could be patrons for heroes or adversaries plotting across the elemental boundaries. Al-Qadim also gave us the concept of tasked genies, a novel twist. Tasked genies were genies created or bred to perform specific roles, essentially genie specialists. The Al-Qadim monstrous compendium detailed several, such as the architect genie, a genie savant in building and engineering, the guardian genie, bound to protect a place or treasure, the slave of the lamp, a genie cursed to servitude of a lamp or ring, akin to Aladdin's genie, the weather genie, capable of controlling climate for agriculture, and more. Over multiple Al-Qadim expansions, no fewer than a dozen tasked genie types appeared: the architect, binder, artist, oathbinder, slayer, guardian, herdsman, messenger, miner, deceiver, warmonger, winemaker, and harem servant genies were introduced across products like Secrets of the Lamp, Assassin Mountain, City of Delights, and a few in the monstrous compendium annuals. Each filled a niche in genie society. For example, Assassin Mountain, 1993, presented the deceiver genie, adept at trickery and disguise, and the oathbinder genie, specializing in magically enforcing contracts. City of Delights, 1993, gave us the administrator genie, skilled bureaucrats of genie courts, and the harem servant genie, entrancing attendants. Secrets of the Lamp, 1993, included messenger and miner genies. These new genie variants were of varying moral alignment. Some were neutral or even benevolent in nature, like artist genies creating beauty, while others, such as slayer genies, were quite sinister. The inclusion of tasked genies was both a way to incorporate more Arabian myth flavor, for example, the notion of a genie of the lamp explicitly cursed to service, and to give dungeon masters tools for exotic encounters, from a philosophical genie painter to a deadly genie hitman. Speaking of Secrets of the Lamp, this 1993 Al-Qadim boxed set was entirely dedicated to genies. It featured a 64-page Genie lore book, one of the most comprehensive treatises on genies D&D had ever produced. Within its pages, it detailed the magnificent locales of genie civilization, the sevenfold mazework of the Great Dismal Delve, the Dao's labyrinthine underworld empire, the Court of Ice and Steel, Djinn leadership's mountain palace of crystal and cloud, the City of Brass in exhaustive detail, from its golden towers to its brazen streets, and the citadel of 10,000 pearls, Marid's underwater capital. It also described genie customs, such as their views on slavery, hospitality, and revenge. For instance, Dao in 2nd edition were unabashed slavers. Secrets of the Lamp describes how Dao use yak men, a wicked humanoid race, as middlemen to capture human slaves for their minds. Djinn in Zakhara were depicted as relatively benign. They ride whirlwinds, and tribes of Djinn sometimes even interact peacefully with mortal desert tribes, guided by the ethos of hospitality. Jann took on a major role in Al-Qadim as well. They became the self-appointed guardians of the wilderness of Zakhara, noble nomads who might aid travelers or serve powerful sha'irs, genie-binding wizards. The Genie Law book codified how genie wishes operate. Generally, only noble genies, the ruling class, or uniquely powerful ones can grant the classic 3 wishes, and even then, with constraints. It made clear that lesser genies like Jann cannot grant wishes at all. In fact, a rumor in Zakharan lore holds that Jann were created by powerful elementals specifically to handle the burden of granting wishes for other genies, because the act of wish-granting is taxing or perilous, an in-world rationale for why only some genies do it. While Al-Qadim delved into the cultural and social facets of genies, another 2nd edition setting was exploring the cosmic role of the Elemental Lords. Planescape. Planescape, released 1994, was the celebrated setting of the multiverse, connecting all planes including the elemental ones. In Planescape, the elemental planes were no longer static, mostly uninhabited expanses as early AD&D had them. They were vibrant realms with politics and personalities. The Planescape Monstrous Compendium. 3. Inner Planes, 1998, edited by Monty Cook, and associated sourcebooks brought back the Archomentals, another term for Elemental Lords, and for the first time introduced the benevolent counterparts to the evil princes. The 4 princes of elemental good were named Chan, Princess of Good Air, Sunis, Princess of Good Earth, Ben-Hadar, Prince of Good Water, and Zaman-Rul, Prince of Good Fire. These beings had been hinted at in prior lore. There was a Dragon magazine article in 1983 that mentioned a good Prince of Fire aiding the Wind Dukes, for example, but 2nd edition solidified them. Planescape portrayed the good and evil Archomentals as opposing forces, much like angels and demons. Dragon magazine issues number 347 and number 353, 2006, towards the end of 3rd edition but conceptually building on Planescape notes, gave extensive write-ups of these Archomentals, referencing Planescape sources. In 2nd edition's Planescape, it was said that the princes of elemental evil were themselves rumoured to be spawn of the elder elemental eye, Tharizdun, which adds an even darker twist to their origin. Meanwhile, the princes of good were supposedly birthed by the elemental planes themselves as a balancing force. Planescape also expanded the roster of Archomentals with lesser-known ones, para-elemental and quasi-elemental lords. The Inner Planes book, 1998, featured Archomentals like Sun Sing of the Plane of Vacuum, Entomoch, and Ogrémoch's estranged twin Sunis of Earth. Sunis is good, Ogrémoch evil, Chilimba, Prince of Magma, Akak, Prince of Smoke, and Bwim, Prince of Ooze. However, it treated some of these as less godlike than the main 4. For example, Chilimba, Ekak, and Bwim in Planescape were described as exceedingly strong mephits who staked territorial claims but weren't on par with an Imix. This hierarchical detail showed 2nd edition's nuanced approach. Not every elemental lord is equal. There are elemental hierarchies. In Planescape adventures, these beings occasionally took the stage. The adventure Dead Gods, 1997, even tells of Bwim being slain and succeeded by his daughter Bwim II. An intriguing storyline demonstrating that Archomentals could have dynasties and could be vulnerable, unlike the practically unkillable greater deities. Genies also made appearances in other second edition contexts. The Forgotten Realms integrated genies via regional lore. For instance, the ancient history of Calimshan in Faerun revolved around the reign of a Genie Lord, Calim, and an Efreeti Pasha, Memnon, who warred for control of that land thousands of years ago. According to Realms lore, as detailed in sourcebooks like Empires of the Shining Sea, 1998, Calim and Memnon's conflict was so cataclysmic it created the Calim Desert and ended only when elven high mages bound both genies into slumber, Calim in the sky and Memnon beneath the sands. This story, echoing the Genie War mythos, became a cornerstone of Calimshan's history and was revisited in late 3rd edition and 4th edition Realms developments. Another Realms product, Corsairs of the Great Sea, 1994, included an adventure where the players could free an imprisoned Marid. And in Realm Space, 1991, a Spelljammer supplement, it's noted that the star of the Kryn space system, in the Dragonlance setting, is actually populated by Efreet, a wild notion that Efreeti had colonized a sun. These cross-setting tidbits illustrated that genies were not confined to an Arabian setting. They popped up in Gothic Ravenloft. There's a Dark Lord named Arijani, who is the offspring of a Dao and a Rakshasa, essentially a genie tiger fiend hybrid. In Dark Sun, the elemental clerics of Athas revered elemental powers that might be akin to Archomentals. And even in the high-tech crossover Gamma world, via the Fantastic Science article linking mutants to genie-like beings, genies had become a truly ubiquitous part of D&D's multiverse by the end of 2nd edition. Lastly, from a design history perspective, the 2nd edition era saw a moderation of some 1st edition extremes. The game moved away from some of the screw-the-players mentality of Gygaxian dungeon mastering to a more narrative approach. Where 1st edition's monster manual might tersely say, Efreet will attempt to pervert wishes, and leave it at that, 2nd edition products like Secrets of the Lamp provided detailed guidance on how a genie might fulfill a wish creatively, but not necessarily malevolently. They framed genies as characters with motives. An Efreeti might twist a wish out of spite, whereas a Genie might do so out of playful humor or to teach humility. There was also an effort to respectfully portray the cultures that inspired these creatures. The Al-Qadim line was notable for consulting cultural sources and portraying Zakhara as a land of enlightened equality and learning, avoiding some Orientalist clichés. Genie depictions in Al-Qadim art by Carl Waller and others were sumptuous and varied, from the hulking basalt-skinned Efreet wielding scimitars of flame to the elegant genie riding whirlwinds over palm-dotted oases. This era clearly loved genies. It gave them families, jobs, hobbies. One Al-Qadim short story mentions a married poet composing couplets in bubbles of water, and even a sense of humor. It is little wonder that genies went from occasional monsters to fan-favorite non-player characters and even potential player character options, the Planescape supplement. The inner planes allowed high-level characters to petition to become elemental beings, and Savage Species, 2003, later provided rules for playing as a genie or Efreeti character. In summary, AD&D 2nd edition transformed genies from exotic encounters into a richly integrated part of the D&D mythos, complete with dynasties, courts, and cultural contexts. Simultaneously, it expanded the concept of Elemental Lords, contrasting the malevolence of the princes of elemental evil with newly illuminated princes of good, all residing in a planescape-guided balance. By 1999, a dungeon master had at their fingertips the tools to run an entire campaign centered on genie politics or an elemental war. A party might dine with the Caliph of all Djinn one session and battle Olhydra's crushing waves the next. The era's end found Genies and Elemental Lords not only well-established but beloved elements of D&D's vast tapestry, primed to leap into the next millennium of gaming. The year 2000 brought Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition, a revamp of the rules system under Wizards of the Coast. Mechanically, 3rd edition recalibrated monsters with the new challenge rating system and a unified D20 mechanic, but it also largely preserved the lore from late 2nd edition. Genies and Elemental Lords carried forward into 3rd edition with relatively few changes to their fictional underpinnings, though there were notable developments in how players and dungeon masters could interact with them. In the Monster Manual for D&D 3rd edition 2000, only the Genie and Efreet were included as standard monsters. These entries reiterated their classic powers: flight, invisibility, whirlwind for Djinn, fire immunity, heat aura, fiery spell-like abilities for Efreet, and updated their statistics to the new rules. The Genie in 3rd edition, for instance, had the ability to create food and water and could use major creation spells, echoes of the 1st edition, 2nd edition abilities in a new spell-based format. And the Efreet notably had the ability grant 3 wishes to non-genies as a 1 per day spell-like ability. This meant any encounter with an Efreet always carried the theoretical possibility of obtaining wishes, a fact that did not escape players' notice. The Dao and Marid did not appear in the initial 3rd edition Monster Manual, but were soon covered in the Manual of the Planes, 2001, and later the Monster Manual 2, 2002. The Dao and Marid entries in Manual of the Planes confirmed their return. Dao as cruel earthen genies with petrifying touch and pass-wall abilities, Marids as tempestuous water lords with powerful spell-like abilities over water and weather. The Jann reappeared in the 3.5 revision Monster Manual, 2003, portrayed as desert-dwelling, moderately powered genies who could plane shift between the material and elemental planes for short periods. One of the biggest changes of 3rd edition was not in lore, but in game mechanics, summoning and binding spells. With the introduction of spells like Planar Binding and Gate, enterprising players realized they could potentially summon genies to bargain for wishes. In earlier editions, summoning a genie was usually through a specific item or limited spell, but 3rd edition's generic summoning spells were more flexible, if dangerous. This led to what became known as the Efreet wish loophole in the player community. A sufficiently high-level wizard could, in theory, bind an Efreet and extract its 3 wishes per day, even attempting to chain-bind multiple Efreet in succession. Although such tactics were subject to dungeon master adjudication and the wrath of the Efreet and its kin, it highlighted how 3rd edition's systematic rules could enable novel and sometimes game-breaking interactions with genies. The designers even acknowledged this in part by making the Efreet's wish-granting a limited resource, 3 wishes total per binding in some interpretations, or 1 binding yields up to 3 wishes, then the Efreet departs. This wish economy became a famous quirk of late 3rd edition optimization discussions and showed how genies, long a story device, could also be pieces in the grand economic puzzle of magic item creation and spellcasting at the highest levels. From a narrative perspective, 3rd edition largely leaned on the existing body of lore for genies. Forgotten Realms in 3rd edition, for instance, revisited the ancient genie history of Calimshan. The 3rd edition Forgotten Realms campaign setting, 2001, and Magic of Faerun, 2002, mentioned the lingering effects of Calim and Memnon's bindings, setting up plot threads that would actually be resolved much later in 4th edition, 5th edition. But one standout 3rd edition product for genie lore was Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil, 2001, by Monty Cook. This adventure was a sequel to the 1985 Temple of Elemental Evil, and it went full tilt into Elemental Lord territory. It featured the cult of the Elder Elemental Eye resurfacing and attempting to summon the princes of elemental evil into the world. In its climax, the fire cult succeeds in summoning Imix, Prince of Evil Fire, as the final boss battle. This was the first time in a long while that an elemental prince appeared on stage in a major published adventure. Imix in 3rd edition was given game stats, a colossal being of living flame with godlike strength. His appearance in Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil firmly canonized the princes of elemental evil in the 3rd edition era and tied them to Tharizdun. The module makes explicit that the Elder Elemental Eye is an aspect of Tharizdun, and Imix refers to Tharizdun as his father, creator. The adventure even allowed player characters who thoroughly researched to learn lore about the other princes, Olhydra, Jann, Ogrémoch, as lurking threats. In this way, 3rd edition, which was often seen as focused on mechanics, still carried forward big pieces of story. The Elemental Lords were not forgotten. In 2006 to 2007, Dragon Magazine's aforementioned articles, number 347 and number 353, provided updated lore and 3.5 statistics for both the evil and good Archomentals, effectively updating the old Planescape material for 3rd edition. These articles deepened the personalities of these beings. Imix was characterized as an arrogant primal force who imagines himself a literal son of fire and pretender to godhood, Olhydra as spiteful and relentlessly hungry to drown all, Jann as aloof and calculating, etc. On the side of good, Zaman Rule, Prince of Good Fire, was depicted as a young upstart leading a rebellion against Imix, adding a layer of epic drama among elementals. Campaign settings and supplements of the 3rd edition/3.5 era integrated genies in various ways. The Forgotten Realms had an influx of Genesee, planet-touched descendants of genies, indicating genies' continued extracurricular activities with mortals. In the City of the Spider Queen module, 2002, Drow wizards summon an Efreet as part of their schemes. Expedition to the Demon Web Pits, 2007, features a minor cameo by a Genie who can aid the party in an air node. Meanwhile, outside of Toril, the Ghostwalk campaign setting, 2003, bizarrely had a city with an Efreet beggar king. The Manual of the Planes and later Planar Handbook, 2004, for 3rd edition, gave Dungeon Masters tools for adventures on the elemental planes, reaffirming locales like the City of Brass and describing how, for instance, a mortal might seek audience with the Great Khan of the Tao for earth-shaking favors. In Savage Species, 2003, the game even offered a way for players to play as a Genie or Efreet by level adjusting their monster abilities. A Genie player character could eventually gain the ability to grant a limited wish at the Dungeon Master's discretion, an unusual but intriguing option that some groups experimented with. During this era, art and aesthetics for Genies kept pace with the times. D&D 3rd edition artwork portrayed Genies in highly detailed, dynamic poses. The Djinn often depicted swirling within sandstorms or clouds, and Efreet shown towering with scimitars amidst flames. The City of Brass was illustrated in the Manual of the Planes as a glittering domed city on a fiery sea, very much in line with earlier descriptions. Cover art of the Dungeon Master's Guide 3.5, 2003, even included a small icon of a brass lamp, subtly acknowledging the Genie trope. The synergy of D&D with the video game world also continued here. BioWare's Neverwinter Nights, 2002, and Baldur's Gate 2, 2000, brought Genies to player character screens. In Baldur's Gate 2, Shadows of Amn, the player encounters a pair of squabbling Dao genies in the town of Trademeet who must be appeased to lift a curse. A memorable side quest that showed genies as schemers and bargainers rather than mere combat monsters. That game also has a friendly Genie merchant, Joluv, in the expansion, and a captive Efreet that a wizard tries to trap. Neverwinter Nights featured a Genie companion in one of its expansions and an encounter with an Efreet in a wizard's planar laboratory. These appearances, though outside tabletop, fed back into fan expectations. Players now had a visual and interactive sense of Genie personalities, from the haughty and sarcastic Dao to the affable Djinn. Back in tabletop, an interesting offshoot of D&D 3.5 was the Miniatures Handbook, 2003, and the D&D Miniatures collectible game. In the Miniatures line, iconic genies were made into figurines. The Efreet miniature, 2004, was a large, red-skinned genie warrior that many dungeon masters happily plunked on the table to represent noble Efreet or Sultan himself in City of Brass adventures. There was also a Genie miniature with translucent lower body swirling into air. These products, though ancillary, reinforced Genie's iconic status. By the end of the 3.5 era in 2007, Genies and Elemental Lords had been thoroughly woven into both the mechanics and lore of D&D's multiverse. They transitioned smoothly into the new rules, continued to star in adventures, and even served as playable options under certain rules, something that would have been unthinkable in 1977. They also became a linchpin in high-level play considerations, the whole wish economy discourse, and remained popular in popular culture through D&D's influence, with recognizable examples in computer RPGs and novels. As Wizards of the Coast prepared the next upheaval, the radical 4th edition, Genies stood as familiar faces that had appeared in every edition thus far. Players knew if they saw an ornate brass bottle or an old oil lamp in a treasure hoard, an exciting and possibly treacherous encounter might be literally in the works. Meanwhile, Imix and his fellow elemental princes had graduated from obscure fiend folio entries to starring villains in mainstream adventures, ensuring their legacy would burn, quake, howl, and crash onward. The launch of D&D 4th edition marked a dramatic shift in many of the game's core assumptions and cosmology. In this new vision, the cosmos was restructured around the dichotomy of elemental chaos versus astral order. The traditional inner planes were fused into a single churning expanse called the elemental chaos. In this milieu, the concept of elemental lords underwent a profound transformation, and even genies were reimagined under the broader category of elemental creatures. Perhaps the biggest change was the introduction or elevation of the primordials, a class of godlike elemental titans that included many familiar faces. In 4th edition lore, Archomentals were essentially folded into the concept of primordials. The primordials were said to be the progenitors of creation, wild titans who forged the world from raw elemental substance before the gods brought order and permanence. This mythos was heavily inspired by real-world, mythological Titan-Olympian wars and earlier fantasy, such as Moorcock's Forces of Chaos versus Law. According to 4th edition's Manual of the Planes, 2008, and The Plane Below, Secrets of the Elemental Chaos, 2009, the primordials waged an epic conflict known as the Dawn War against the gods, a war which concluded with most primordials defeated, slain, or imprisoned by the victorious deities. This recasting placed beings like Imix and Ogrémoch onto a cosmic stage as ancient titans rather than mere princes. Imix, for instance, was explicitly listed as a primordial, one of the few who survived the Dawn War and still lurked in the elemental chaos, plotting fiery ruin upon the mortal world. He was described as being served by fire titans and fiery cultists. In 4th edition, even some goblins worshipped Imix under the moniker the Fire Lord. Likewise, Olhydra, the evil water princess, and Jann air, were counted among the primordials, as was Ogrémoch, earth. 4th edition material introduced some new primordials as well, greatly expanding the roster of elemental powers. Some were reimagined from earlier obscure mentions, for example, Mualtar, the Thunder Serpent, a colossal storm dragon bound in chains by the gods, was introduced in Dragon magazine number 370. Others were entirely new creations. Atropos, the world-born dead, essentially an undead primordial remnant, and moon-sized entity of death. Balkoth, the groaning king, a decapitated ash-filled primordial. Vedzuvu, the burning mountain, a volcano primordial partially phased out of reality. These entities sat alongside Imix and the classical elemental princes as equals in the hierarchy of villainy. It was a veritable pantheon of elemental might. In terms of game mechanics and portrayal, 4th edition gave these primordials the stature of quasi-deities. They were often beyond the scope of direct combat, intended more as background lore or epic-level boss fights. For example, the Dungeon magazine adventure Lords of Chaos presented Mualtar as a world-shaking threat that heroes might strive not to kill, for that was beyond them, but to reinforce or adjust its bindings. Imix in 4th edition received a full stat block in Manual of the Planes, 2008, where he is CR 30+ and can annihilate armies. Likewise, Ogrémoch got stats in the Dungeon magazine adventure Revenge of the Giants, tying him to a plot with giants, as giants in 4th edition had a primordial patron named the Adamantine King, a subtle reference to Ogrémoch. The princes of elemental evil, as they were still called, thus re-emerged in 4th edition as among the most ancient and formidable beings in existence. Their good counterparts were not emphasized in 4th edition. 4th edition being more focused on a world view of elemental are generally chaotic and dangerous. Characters seeking benevolent elemental allies in 4th edition were more likely to appeal to minor godlings or exalted rather than archomentals, since primordial equals chaos in that paradigm. And what of the genies during this upheaval? Genies in 4th edition were still present, but their portrayal was adjusted to fit the new cosmology. The term genie became a keyword for a subset of elemental humanoids. In 4th edition's Monster Manual, 2008, the standard genies did not appear. Presumably, they were being held for a later supplement. Indeed, the Djinn reappeared in Monster Manual 2, 2009, and the Efreet in Monster Manual 3, 2010, and other sources. The 4th edition Efreet, no longer called Efreeti, since 4th edition often used singular equals plural names, were described as fierce elemental nobles in the City of Brass, with an updated origin. The Efreet were now explicitly a creation of the Primordial War. It was said the primordial known as Brass, a now imprisoned primordial, had literally built the City of Brass and created the Efreet to inhabit and rule it as his servants. When the gods defeated Brass, the Efreet took over his city and now rule it themselves, ever plotting to free their creator or conquer in his name. This gave Efreet a bit of a different narrative twist. They were still cruel tyrants, but now with a hint of created purpose and an ancestral grudge. Stat-wise, 4th edition Efreet were typically high Paragon tier enemies, level 16 to 18 for normal Efreet, up to mid-20s for Efreet nobles and raid leaders. They had abilities like fiery teleportation and sword strikes that unleashed gouts of flame, highly tactical, as was 4th edition's style. The City of Brass itself got significant attention in 4th edition's The Plane Below, 2009, which devoted a section to it. It remained the bustling hub of the elemental chaos, a cosmopolitan trading city, if one can stand the heat, where Efreet are the aristocracy and slave trade is rampant, though 4th edition's depiction toned down some details for a broader audience. It's noteworthy that 4th edition products occasionally used the term City of Brass as a shorthand for the entire Efreet civilization. One module described a scenario of adventurers possibly allying with a faction of Efreet against a demon prince, showing Efreet as nuanced political actors rather than always monsters to kill. Djinn in 4th edition were characterized as mercurial and freedom-loving air spirits. Not an enormous shift from prior editions, but they were less emphasized than Efreet. They appeared as potential quest-givers or unpredictable allies. An example from 4th edition literature: a Djinn might be found wandering the deserts of the world in disguise, just because the elemental chaos is too confining for their adventurous spirit. The Marid and Dao were scarcely mentioned in early 4th edition, but finally got some stats in Monster Manual 3, 2010. Marids were illustrated as towering blue-skinned figures with piscine or aquatic features, wielding tridents of water. They retained their self-indulgent and proud behavior. Dao became earth genies with slave-taking habits intact. The Jann were absent. 4th edition did not reintroduce the Jann, likely because the concept of a weak, mixed-element genie didn't fit as well into the more stark elemental worldview of that edition. Instead of Jann, 4th edition introduced a new type of quasi-genie, the Kayal, also known as shadow genies. The Kayal first appeared in 3.5's Tome of Magic, 2006 actually, but in 4th edition they were integrated as genies who had abandoned the elemental chaos to live in the Shadowfell, plane of shadow. They were masters of illusion and stealth, conceptually somewhat like an elemental genie of darkness. The Kyle highlight how D&D's genie concept was adaptable to new elemental paradigms, shadow being not a classical element, but nonetheless they made a genie of it to suit the flavor of a new class or spell. 4th edition's themes heavily favored elemental conflicts. Many adventures and sourcebooks posited conflicts between primordials, elemental lords, and gods or their servants. The throne of the Elemental Lords, once simply an evocative term, in 4th edition became a literal shattered throne in the elemental chaos that the defeated primordials once sat upon. One of the major 4th edition storylines, the Princes of Elemental Evil season in D&D Encounters, a organized play format, revolved around cultists of Imix, Ogrémoch, etc., trying to bring about devastation. Clearly a homage to the classic Temple of Elemental Evil concept, but recast in the 4th edition context of chaos versus law. It's interesting that while the phrase elemental evil endured, 4th edition's law put all primordials as generally hostile to mortal life, with few exceptions, so even calling them evil was a bit moot. They were forces of chaos beyond good and evil. Nevertheless, cults to these elemental powers thrived in 4th edition, as depicted in the Monster Manual 2 and 3, with elemental cultists and Templar stat blocks dedicated to each prince. For example, the cultist of the Howling Hatred might follow Jann Sebin. In terms of presentation, 4th edition's art and text for genies and elemental lords was high fantasy epic. The primordials were often depicted as enormous and inhuman. For example, Uwian, another new primordial, a lady of winter, was shown as a giantess of ice and storm bestriding a glacier. The princes like Imix got new artwork, Imix was reimagined in some art as a fiery, bull-like colossus or an elemental humanoid of lava. 4th edition was a bit inconsistent because various illustrators took different approaches. Dungeon magazine covers such as issue number 200, January 2012, featured Imix in fiery glory, and an earlier dungeon cover, issue number 174, 4th edition, era, showed an Efreet dueling a blue dragon in the City of Brass, an image that captures the chaos and power of the elemental planes in 4th edition style. Culturally, within the D&D community, 4th edition's changes were polarizing. Some old-school fans lamented the loss of the traditional cosmology and the downplaying of certain creatures like genies, since Archomentals were now primordials and the focus was on them, whereas Genie society got less spotlight outside the City of Brass. However, others enjoyed the fresh angle. By making Elemental Lords into primordial titans, D&D gave them a mythic weight that put them on par with, say, Lolth or Bahamut in stories. Genies, meanwhile, became more tightly integrated as the mortal-speaking, human-relatable face of the elemental chaos. They were the ones you could talk to or make deals with, in contrast to an ineffable primordial. This is seen in the 4th edition Revenge of the Giants adventure, 2009, where the players, trying to thwart a giant ritual to revive a primordial, might negotiate with an Efreet leader named Prince of Flames for information or aid. That Efreet has his own agenda, perhaps freeing a primordial of fire in exchange, showing the layered treachery one can expect of genie kind. Additionally, 4th edition introduced the term elemental prince occasionally to refer to primordials, but tended to use Prince of Evil only historically. It did keep the classic names though. Imix, Ogrémoch, etc. were still very much in play. Good Archomentals like Jann and Sunnis were seldom mentioned. 4th edition's tone wasn't as interested in elemental good versus elemental evil, but rather elementals versus gods or versus mortals. When it comes to Genasi, the genie-descended humanoids, 4th edition made them a core player race in the Forgotten Realms Player's Guide, 2008, and the Player's Handbook 2, 2009. Genasi in 4th edition had manifestations of different elements: air, earth, fire, water, and a new one, storm. This increased the presence of elemental themes in parties and, by extension, genies as ancestors or figures of reverence in Genasi culture. A Genasi character in 4th edition might proudly trace their lineage to a noble Djinn, or wear jewelry styled after the City of Brass, etc. It's another way genie lore indirectly permeated the game. In summary, Era 4, 4th edition, dramatically reframed the elemental landscape. Elemental Lords became primordials, towering figures of creation, injecting the D&D cosmology with an epic creation myth where Imix and his kind nearly destroyed the world at its birth. Genies were still present as powerful elementals, but were somewhat overshadowed by their Titan-esque progenitors. However, genies continued to be the most personable of elemental beings. They were the ones you could meet in a market or summon in a ritual, whereas a primordial was more likely the subject of an adventure's overarching plot. And though 4th edition eventually came to a close in 2013, the ideas it introduced about elemental lords would echo into the next edition, albeit with some reversions to classic form, as we shall see. Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, 2014, sought to synthesize the best of previous editions, and in doing so it returned many aspects of lore to classic form while keeping select innovations from 4th edition. For genies and elemental lords, this meant a conscious restoration of traditional elements, no pun intended. For example, the inner planes were reinstated as distinct realms, plane of fire, plane of air, etc., and the princes of elemental evil were reintroduced to the spotlight in a big way through the game's early published adventures. At the same time, 5th edition incorporated 2nd edition and 3rd edition's rich cultural detail for Genies, and even made Genies a playable character influence via class options. Right out of the gate, the Monster Manual, 2014, for 5th edition includes all 4 main Genie types: Dao, Genie, Efreet, and Marid. This was the first time since AD&D that all 4 had appeared together in a core bestiary. Their descriptions emphasized their personalities and courtly nature. The Dao are called the cruel genies of the elemental plane of earth, who covet riches and enslave lesser beings, dwelling in their gem-encrusted cavern palaces in the great dismal delve. The Djinn are noble genies from the plane of air, proud of their freedom and generosity, dwelling in drifting cloud islands and opulent airy fortresses. The Efreet are described as ruthless tyrants from the plane of fire, with the city of brass as their capital. The text highlights their love of cruel intrigue and how they sometimes keep mortals as slaves or playthings. The Marids are portrayed as the highest in Genie social rank, the self-proclaimed rulers of all Genie kind, hailing from the boundless oceans of the plane of water, known for their grandiose storytelling and tempestuous moods. Mechanically, each Genie is quite formidable: CR 11 for Genie and Dao, CR 12 for Marid, CR 11 for Efreet in 5th edition, and carries innate spellcasting that harks back to older edition abilities. Notably, each Genie type in 5th edition has limited wish as an option. A Dao, Genie, or Efreet can grant 3 wishes to a mortal per day as an action, but only if it chooses, so no compulsion, unless magically bound. This makes random encounters with Genies less likely to upend a campaign's balance, while still allowing story arcs where a Genie's wish-granting is a focal point, often as a negotiated reward or a plot device. 5th edition also revived the lesser Genie, the Jann, although somewhat quietly. The Jann is mentioned in passing in some products, and got a full stat block in Tales from the Yawning Portal, 2017, as a non-player character encounter, confirming they exist as the weaker, all-element Genies who roam the prime material. But the core books didn't highlight Jann, likely since their comparatively low impact. The early flagship campaign for 5th edition was Princes of the Apocalypse, 2015, part of the Elemental Evil storyline, which was essentially a reimagining of the Temple of Elemental Evil premise for 5th edition's Forgotten Realms. In this campaign, set in the Dezarin Valley of the Sword Coast, 4 cults devoted to Imix, Ogrémoch, Olhydra, and Jann attempt to unleash their patrons upon the world. The adventure culminates, potentially, in battles against these elemental princes of evil themselves, each statted as a formidable CR 16 to 18 boss monster. Imix, for example, is depicted much as before, an 18-foot tall living inferno in vaguely humanoid shape, radiating deadly heat and hurling fire. Ogrémoch as a walking mountain of malice, etc. Princes of the Apocalypse firmly established these Archomentals in 5th edition Realms canon by tying them to the ancient Drow worship of the elder elemental Eye, Tharizdun, and the devastation of an event called the Elemental Evil Crisis in Faerun. Interestingly, 5th edition's version of these princes shows continuity with 4th edition's idea that they are imprisoned titans. In the adventure, each prince can only manifest through a portal called an elemental node, suggesting they were sealed away until the cults call them forth. When the princes emerge, their presence ravages the surrounding lands, driving home their threat. For example, Imix's arrival causes an inferno, Olhydra's creates a localized flood, etc. Narratively, they serve as both epic foes and as testaments to the folly of mortals trafficking with primordial powers. The adventure even allows that if the heroes fail to stop the summoning, an apocalypse could occur, hinting at the scale of destruction princes could cause, and giving dungeon masters an excuse to start a new campaign in a devastated world scenario. Notably, Princes of the Apocalypse also provide some lore vignettes on the good Archomentals, Jann, Sunnis, etc. Though they don't appear in the story, it mentions that Zaaman Rul, Good Fire Prince, is Imix's own renegade son who might subtly aid the party via clues, and Sunnis, Good Earth Princess, opposes Ogrémoch's cult. These are small nods, but they show that 5th edition acknowledges the full pantheon of Archomentals, even if the spotlight is usually on the villains. Beyond that big adventure, 5th edition integrated Genies in many corners. The core Dungeon Master's Guide, 2014, features the City of Brass as one of its highlighted planar locations in the section on the Inner Planes, complete with flavor text about golden domes and Efreeti pashas and the dangers of dealing in the bazaar where wishes are currency. The 5th edition depiction emphasizes the city's cruelty and wonder in equal measure. It's the most likely planar metropolis player characters might actually visit on the elemental planes, and indeed Adventurers League expeditions in early 5th edition included missions to the City of Brass. One published adventure, Tales from the Yawning Portal, the Hidden Shrine of Tamawachan, a conversion of a classic module, includes a trapped Efreeti named Takatan, whom clever players can free. If released, he doesn't turn on the party, but thanks them and, depending on Dungeon Master, might grant a favor. This shows a design leaning toward genie encounters being more than just fights. They can be role-played and bargained with. The Waterdeep Dungeon of the Mad Mage Mega Dungeon 2018 has an entire level ruled by an Efreeti warlord. Halaster Blackcloak, the Mad Mage himself, had struck a deal with this Efreet. Players in that adventure can negotiate with or battle the Efreeti and his elemental servitors in a clear homage to the idea of dungeon level as mini-City of Brass. In 5th edition's Forgotten Realms, the ancient genie storyline of Calimshan, long dormant, was finally advanced in the late 1480s DR through novels and game hints. By the era of 5th edition, the seal on the great Djinn Kalim and the Efreet Memnon is broken, and those 2 Genie Lords are released, causing upheaval in Calimshan. This is touched on in the novel The Sentinel, 2015, and the Adventurers League storyline, Elemental Evil. Essentially, the conflict of Kalim and Memnon resumes, providing a backdrop of genie warfare in modern Faerun. By 1490 DR, the lore implies both genies are once again contained. The Calimshan humans used mighty magic to banish both, not wanting either as a master. But the ripple effects, political vacuum, stray genies left behind, magic artifacts, are all fertile ground for Realms campaigns. One of the most beloved additions in 5th edition came with the book Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, 2020, the introduction of the Genie Patron for Warlock player characters. This subclass lets a Warlock forge a pact with a powerful genie, Dao, Djinni, Efreeti or married. The player chooses which lineage. The subclass is dripping with thematic flavor drawn from all prior lore. The Warlock gains a genie's vessel, often a lamp, urn, or bottle, that functions like a mini-home. Yes, the Warlock can retreat into their lamp and even bring friends in a magical house party scenario. This is directly inspired by the idea of a genie dwelling in a lamp. Their spells and features change depending on their patron's element. For example, an Efreeti patron warlock might get fire spells and resist fire. A married patron warlock gets water spells, etc. At higher levels, the Genie Warlock even gains a limited wish ability, reflecting their patron's power. The subclass effectively allows players to play a genie-blessed character, further cementing Genie's place not just as monsters or non-player characters, but as integral to character backstories and party composition. It also acknowledges the noble genies as individuals. Though it doesn't name specific genie patrons, dungeon masters are free to introduce, say, the great Caliph Hussam al-Balil ben Nafat al-Ugayyim, an example name from Secrets of the Lamp, as the Warlock's patron. The Genie patron proved popular, blending mechanical strength with rich roleplay possibilities. Imagine the pact negotiations, the errands your Genie patron might demand. Recover this lost sapphire from a thief in Waterdeep, and I shall reward you with a fragment of my power. On the cultural side, 5th edition has continued to celebrate genies in a manner respectful of their origins while moving them firmly into global fantasy. The art in 5th edition, for instance, portrays genies with a variety of influences. The Efreet art shows a towering, muscular figure with glowing, rune-inscribed bracers and a topknot of flame. Clearly otherworldly, not a caricature of any human culture, yet his pose and attire, shimmering silks, curved scimitar, nod to the Middle Eastern aesthetic. The Genie art shows a handsome blue-skinned figure emerging from a whirlwind, arms crossed in a stance both regal and a touch mischievous. Marids are depicted as large Djinn-like figures, often carrying a trident and wearing coral and pearls. Dao illustrations show dark, stony-skinned hulks laden with gold and gems, with a perpetually scowling visage. These designs echo earlier depictions, but with the high fantasy polish of modern D&D art. 5th edition's tone in writing genies emphasizes their caprice and pride. For example, the Monster Manual notes that Djinn are as proud as they are carefree, and that Marids consider themselves so superior that they refuse to acknowledge any other creature as their peer, not even other genies, with a tongue-in-cheek aside that this makes diplomacy with a Marid challenging at best. Efreet are straightforwardly described as slavers and despots whom few creatures can resist serving out of either fear or a desire to share in the Efreet's wealth and power. The Dao entry describes their delight in betrayal and greed, stating a Dao will strike a deal that sounds generous only to twist it to its own gain at the last minute. All these characterizations reinforce genies as memorable personalities in an adventure. An encounter with a genie might lead to a tense social negotiation, a trick, or an unexpected act of rare kindness, as opposed to a simple fight. Elemental Lords Archomentals in 5th edition outside the Princes of the Apocalypse have had quieter mentions. Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, 2018, briefly mentions the eternal conflict between elemental forces and the material plane, touching on Archomentals as deep background. In 2022, Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel, an anthology of adventures, includes Kata'ani's Jewel, an adventure where an Earth genie, Dao, plays a prominent role in a tale of reconciliation and cultural exchange, showcasing how genies can be integrated into stories beyond combat. In this case, the Dao is convinced to cease its oppression of a village through the efforts of the protagonists, highlighting empathy and negotiation. As of the present day, 2025, genies remain a beloved part of D&D's bestiary and cosmology. They bridge the gap between the mortal realm and the wild elemental realms, serving as quest-givers, adversaries, patrons, or even comic relief at times. A married gourmand might enlist adventurers to find an incredibly rare spice, for instance. Their grand courts, the City of Brass, the Citadel of Ice and Steel, the sevenfold maze-work, continue to beckon imaginative players to step beyond the portal and experience the wonders and perils there. And with Wizards of the Coast constantly expanding on classic settings and ideas, Genies stand ready to appear in any new setting that touches the elemental themes. For example, an upcoming Planescape product, 2023's Planescape, Adventures in the Multiverse, updates the setting of Sigil and the Outlands, which likely includes mentions of the elemental planes and their denizens. Indeed, the Outlands border includes the fabled gate town of Aquatic, which leads to the plane of water, no doubt full of marids and water weirds. The continuity of Genie lore from 1974 to now is remarkably intact. Core names and roles have persisted, even as their context has shifted slightly with each edition's philosophy. Essays, OD&D and future developments. As D&D looks ahead to its next evolution, currently codenamed OD&D, essentially the 2024 revised editions of the core books, the trajectory of Genies and Elemental Lords appears to be one of refinement rather than revolution. The design team has expressed that OD&D aims to update rules while honoring existing lore, so we do not expect a dramatic planar upheaval on the scale of 4th edition's changes. Instead, what is anticipated is that Genies and elemental creatures will get minor mechanical tweaks and perhaps expanded roleplay tools. In Unearthed Arcana playtest materials released in 2022 to 2023, the Warlock class, for example, has been undergoing revision, but notably the Genie patron remains a featured subclass. Early playtest documents showed a Genie patron Warlock with slightly altered features for balance, but the core fantasy, having a genie in a lamp as your otherworldly sponsor, is still front and center. This indicates the designers understand the popularity of that archetype and have no intention of removing it. In fact, feedback from playtests, as seen on forums and Reddit, highlighted that the Genie Warlock was considered one of the most flavorful subclasses in the game, so it is likely to get even a bit of polish, perhaps extra Genie-themed invocations or clearer guidelines for the relationship with the Genie patron. There's even been tongue-in-cheek commentary that a OD&D Warlock with a Genie patron might make the original look tame in power, suggesting some potential buffs, or at least that the design is ensuring it remains competitive. On the monster manual side, the 2024 update, often dubbed the Monster Manual 50th Anniversary Edition, will probably incorporate errata and some new art for Genies, but keep their lore consistent. If anything, we might get clarified information on Genie societies or additional hooks in their descriptions. Wizards of the Coast has been moving towards a presentation that combines lore with story hooks, so perhaps the updated Genie entries will include more concrete examples. For example, an Efreet might be encountered as a ruler of a distant desert city or as the cruel master of a fire giant forge. Consider what grand ambition drives the Efreet you use in your story. Similarly, Elemental Lords like Imix might be given the legendary monster treatment with lair actions and regional effects, as many big 5th edition monsters have. In Princes of the Apocalypse, the princes had some of these features. The new might formalize those, or even present one of the princes as a sample legendary creature. Another area of future development is the multiverse-centric approach WotC is taking. With the Planescape, Adventures in the Multiverse set released in late 2022, planar adventuring is back in focus. Planescape's latest iteration reaffirms classic lore, elemental planes as fundamental, with genies as key inhabitants. The Dungeon Master's Guide 2024 might expand the planar section, perhaps including a template for environmental hazards on elemental planes, or how a native of the plane of fire like an Efreet or salamander might react to planar incursions. Given 5th edition's inclusive approach, they might also highlight genie cultures from various settings. For instance, hinting that in Greyhawk there is an infamous Efreet named Yagrax, who once warred with the Circle of Eight, or that in Eberron, if we consider its unique cosmology, there are no genies on its planes of air, fire, making them mysterious visitors when they do appear. Journeys through the Radiant Citadel notably included Sand Steppe Sanctuaries, an adventure with Middle Eastern flair, but it focused more on elementals than genies. Still, it's likely that WotC will continue to incorporate genies in culturally diverse ways. Moreover, as D&D expands into other media, film, television, digital games, we may see reimaginings of genies that then loop back into the tabletop. For example, the 2023 D&D movie Honor Among Thieves didn't feature a genie, but future shows or movies might. A Desert of Desolation or Al-Qadim adaptation, for instance, would almost certainly bring a genie character to life on screen. If that happens, it could influence the portrayal of genies in official D&D literature, perhaps giving them more defined personalities or even proper names in the core texts. One interesting announced product for 2023 to 2024 is Bigby Presents, Glory of the Giants, which, while primarily about giants, touches on the giant versus elemental theme. For example, an Elder Fire giant might try to broker power from Imix. In that book, it's mentioned that some giants have cults to primordial powers. This suggests that the elemental princes are now considered part of the broader tapestry of D&D antagonists, similar to demon lords or the like, and can cross-pollinate into different storylines, giants, dragons, etc. The fan community and third-party publishers also continue to contribute to genie lore. Kobold Press's Tales of the Old Margreve includes a tale with a mischievous air genie, and there's a growing trove of Dungeon Masters Guild supplements for running adventures in the City of Brass or playing as Genasi with genie lineage options. Wizards has shown an openness to incorporating popular third-party ideas. For example, some UA content clearly draws inspiration from popular homebrew. So, if anything, genies might get even more support in the future, possibly a dedicated adventure or a sourcebook chapter focusing on elemental planes, since 5th edition has done Van Richten's for horror domains, etc. One could imagine a guide to the inner planes in a future planar supplement. In the near-future preview sense, 1D&D stands as an evolution, not a revolution. So genies and elemental lords are poised to continue their role, shining with the legacy accumulated over decades. They have been in D&D since the beginning, and the creative team surely recognizes their enduring appeal. The announced 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide is bringing back the deck of many things, with an Efreet being traditionally one of the possible draws. The Vizier card historically had a genie connotation. And the player's handbook is introducing more expansive dungeon master tools for role-playing, perhaps including negotiation examples or social interaction clues for creatures like genies, which would be handy given how often clever parties talk to genies instead of immediately fighting. In sum, as the game enters its 50th year and beyond, genies and elemental lords remain steadfast fixtures. The present day finds them woven into the official storylines and player options more than ever, and the announced future promises to keep them relevant, whether as mighty patrons, engines of adventure hooks, who doesn't perk up at the plot of a noble Genie needs you to save his long-lost love from an Efreet's harem, or endgame threats. The evolution through each era, from Gygax's pragmatic Djinn to Cook's intricate genie courts to 4th edition's cosmos-shaking primordials to 5th edition's balanced blend, demonstrates D&D's capacity to reinterpret myth for new generations. And as one D&D sets sail, The ship bears a Genie on its mast and an Efreet stoking its engines, heading into yet uncharted seas of imagination where, no doubt, wishes and whirlwinds, betrayals and brass towers await. Over decades of D&D, the core image of the Genie, the towering, part-elemental humanoid capable of wish fulfillment, has inspired myriad variants and offshoots in the game. Some of these are direct extensions within official D&D canon, while others are echoes in related media or even other game systems. One important category of variants is the previously mentioned tasked genies introduced in the Al-Qadim setting. These specialized genies were essentially a creative extrapolation. If genies are elemental spirits with great magical power, might some be bred or magically modified for specific tasks? Thus, we get genies like the minor genie, who has an uncanny knack for finding and extracting ore, or the guardian genie, whose very being is bound to a place or object toward it. These tasked genies enriched gameplay by providing unique encounters. A party might find a pavilion in the desert tended by an oasis genie, another example of tasked genie, essentially a water-tasked genie ensuring an oasis's prosperity, and interacting with such a being could be quite different from dealing with a default Marid or genie. Tasked genies were largely confined to the Zakara setting in 2nd edition, but dungeon masters often port them to homebrew games. Even in 5th edition, though not officially codified, one could easily create a winemaker genie from City of Delights, a genie that ages and perfects wines with magic, or a swordsmith genie to serve as a quest giver or exotic encounter. The presence of these variants underscores that genies in D&D are not a monolith. They have professions and roles, perhaps even castes, within their societies. Another offshoot of genies are the Genasi, the elemental planet-touched or half-genies. Genasi first appeared in 2nd edition's Planescape, the Planewalker's Handbook, 1996, as playable ancestries, essentially mortal beings with a genie or elemental somewhere in their lineage, giving them elemental traits. Originally, the 4 common Genasi corresponded to air, earth, fire, and water, clearly patterned on the idea of genie parentage. For example, a child of a mortal and a genie would be an air Genasi. In 3rd edition's Forgotten Realms and Manual of the Planes, Genasi were further detailed, and in 4th edition they became a core race as mentioned. By 5th edition, Genasi are included in Elemental Evil Player's Companion 2015 and Morden Kanan presents Monsters of the Multiverse 2022. They stand as a testament to genie influence on mortal worlds. Through Genasi, genie blood literally flows in the veins of adventurers, bringing with it both power and narrative hooks. A Genasi character might be hunted by a grandparent Efreet seeking to use them as a pawn, or perhaps approached by genie diplomats who see them as kin. The concept of Genasi has even been taken up outside D&D. Many other fantasy games and fiction now have their own versions of elemental-touched beings, a diffusion of the genie myth. We should also consider the lesser elemental creatures that revolve around genie lore. The elemental weirds, introduced in 3rd edition Sandstorm and earlier in an obscure 2nd edition article, are oracular elemental spirits tied to pools, and while not genies, they show how D&D's elemental ecosystem expanded. There are also mephits, small, impish elemental beings, which often serve as messengers or servants to genies. Dragon magazine once humorously referred to mephits as the obnoxious servants that Archomentals can't live without. In Planescape lore, there were suggestions that some Archomentals, like Chan or Ben-Hadar, actually elevated mephits to sentience, showing a sort of life cycle. A primordial elemental lord might spawn lesser creatures to do its bidding. Para-genies and quasi-genies are another concept that has floated around in lore. Just as there are para-elemental planes, for example smoke, magma, and quasi-elemental planes, lightning, minerals, etc., some creative dungeon masters posited genie-like lords for those. The Inner Planes, 1998, and 2D4 Chan both list entities like Chilimba, a so-called Prince of Magma, or Sun Sing, an elemental of vacuum. While not genies in the traditional sense, a dungeon master might treat them as analogous. Indeed, they were listed among Archomentals. In play, one could encounter a Frostfire Efreet, an Efreet mutated by the para-elemental plane of Ice's touch, or other hybrid genie. The rules haven't explicitly enumerated such hybrids, but novels and fan lore occasionally have. For instance, an old Forgotten Realms novel, The Thousand Orcs, briefly references a cold Efreet artifact, suggesting the existence of an Efreet from an atypical element. A notable offshoot in terms of story impact is the way Genie and Elemental Lord concepts have been borrowed or reinterpreted in other settings. Eberron, a setting introduced in 2004, has a very different cosmology with no direct elemental planes, yet it has Khyber, the underworld, which spawns fiends that include some Rakshasa Rajas, akin to primordial demons. One of them, called Salso, known as Nagar, is essentially a being of living fire with an Efreet-like vibe. So even outside the Great Wheel, the archetype surfaces. Magic, the Gathering, in its crossover supplements with D&D, like Mythic Odysseys of Theros or Planeshift, Zendikar, often uses genie analogues, for example, Sirens of Theros, who make bargains, or Djinn of Air in Zendikar, who are elemental spirits. Another variant worth mentioning is the Elemental Drakes, or elemental cohorts that came up in 4th edition. There were genie steeds, like flying skiffs powered by bound genies, reminiscent of the old idea from Al-Qadim of binding genies into ships. The Sand Voyage of Zakara is a magical ship said to have an Efreeti bound to its furnace. So, technology or magic devices involving genies are a kind of offshoot. For example, in Eberron's steampunk fantasy, one could easily adapt the idea of a bound elemental, like the fire elementals bound to airships, to a bound genie powering something. While Eberron explicitly uses pure elementals rather than sapient genies, for ethical reasons in the setting lore, they didn't want every bound elemental to be a moral issue of slavery. Fan discussions often swirl around, what if that fire elemental is actually an Efreet? Wouldn't that be grim? This loops back to the concept of genie binding, which is as old as the 1st edition Efreeti bottle, and remains an avenue of adventure, freeing a bound genie from servitude or dealing with the consequences when someone does. In the realm of video games beyond the D&D titles, genies have appeared as both enemies and summonable allies. The Baldur's Gate series, 1998 to 2001, we covered, had memorable genie characters, essentially adapting 2nd edition genies faithfully. The Neverwinter Nights series, 2002 to 2008, also featured genies. In NWN's first expansion, Shadows of Undren Tide, the final boss is a powerful pasha of a genie, though a unique one, a Farim genie hybrid achieved via dark magic, illustrating how even D&D's stranger monsters got mixed with genie lore. And Neverwinter Nights 2, 2006, had a chapter where the party deals with a Dao sorceress named Zier, who is using portals to aid the primary villain. Defeating her was a key step, again bringing genie politics into a major plot. Even outside direct D&D adaptations, RPGs like Elder Scrolls, with fire Atronachs that share some DNA with Efreeti, or Final Fantasy with summonable Djinn and Ifrit creatures, show the cultural penetration of these archetypes, originally popularized in a gaming context by D&D. While those aren't D&D canon, they have occasionally circled back. For instance, the Critical Role show, a popular D&D actual play series, included a fire Efreeti character clearly inspired by Final Fantasy's Efreet and D&D's Efreet, demonstrating how broader fantasy media can feed back into D&D campaigns as offshoot interpretations. Within literature, D&D's Genies likely drew from earlier sources, but now one can find D&D novels themselves where genies are focal characters. The Al-Qadim novel City of Delights, 1993, depicts the intrigues of an Efreeti ruler and a Genie vizier in Zakhara's capital. The Forgotten Realms novel The Glass Prison, 2001, features a story of a Dao genie. These narrative explorations often introduce unique genie non-player characters not found in sourcebooks, effectively becoming offshoot variants, for example, a friendly Dao or a repentant Efreet, showing that even within official content, the archetype is flexible. A final intriguing offshoot is the concept of the elemental nobility beyond genies. In Pathfinder RPG, a close cousin of D&D 3.5, they expanded genie lore to include elemental godlings called Imperial Lords and additional genie races like the Shaitan, Earth Genies, essentially their version of Dao, and Jann, similar to D&D's but more integrated. Pathfinder even introduced half-genies called Suleimans, pushing the envelope on genie-human hybrids beyond what D&D did. While Pathfinder is separate, its borrowing and tweaking of genie lore, including making genie binding a big no-no in their setting's culture unless you want genie vengeance, reflects the enduring appeal and adaptability of these concepts. Many D&D players cross-pollinate ideas from Pathfinder back into D&D, treating them as new variants to spice up encounters. In sum, the variants and offshoots of genies and elemental lords in D&D are numerous and rich. From the task-specific genies of Zakhara to the planet-touched genasi walking the material plane, to quasi-elemental princes in obscure reaches of the multiverse, to the reflections in other games and media, all of these underscore the versatility of the genie trope. A dungeon master seeking to surprise savvy players can always introduce a twist on the familiar. Perhaps a noble Efreet who is lawful neutral and keeps a code of honor, or a fallen Genie corrupted by the abyss, a possibility touched on in Dragon magazine lore of an evil Djinn lord named Caliph Guwazi who devoured souls, a fringe case. With such breadth, genies remain fresh in the collective imagination. They can be tricksters, tyrants, mentors, or mysteries. The lineage of each offshoot can often be traced back through the editions, a testament to how the ideas planted in the game's early days have branched out in countless creative directions. Peering across the editions, the role of genies and elemental lords in D&D reveals a dynamic interplay between narrative theme and game mechanics. Thematically, these entities encapsulate the concept of unfettered elemental power bound by personality. They are at once forces of nature and characters with motives. Mechanically, they have oscillated between being high-end challenges and potential sources of boons, especially the infamous wish. One core theme that emerges is freedom versus bondage. In the lore, genies deeply value freedom and hate confinement, as explicitly noted of Djinn from 1st edition onward. This reflects in countless stories, from the archetypal genie in the lamp who yearns to be free, to adventurers bargaining with a bound Dao in exchange for freeing it from a wizard's summoning circle. Even the evil genies like Efreet are proud and resist being chained, though ironically they'll happily enslave others. This theme resonates with players as it sets up moral quandaries. Do you free the genie for a promise? Do you trust its word? It also serves as a cautionary note in mechanics. Summoning or binding a genie has always carried the risk of the genie perverting your command or seeking retribution. In early editions, this was left to Dungeon Master fiat, for example OD&D/AD&D notes that an uncontrolled Efreet will seek revenge. In 3rd edition, this became codified through things like charisma checks for planar binding spells and the possibility of the genie tricking the caster via twisted wording, essentially mechanizing the theme. Clever players would word their requests carefully, and dungeon masters would roll secretly to see if the genie finds a loophole. In 5th edition, the theme still exists, but the mechanics have safety valves. A gate spell might summon an entity, but unless you can coerce it, it's not obligated, reflecting that freedom theme by requiring either a bargain or force to actually get a genie to serve. Another recurring theme is hubris and consequence. Many genie tales, in D&D and beyond, are morality plays about those who would grasp too much power. The wish-granting aspect is the epitome of that. It's essentially a temptation for players. In the game, whenever a genie or a magic item like a ring of 3 wishes enters the story, players are faced with an almost mythic test. Will they use the wish wisely or succumb to greed and hubris? Gygax's original admonitions about twisting greedy wishes set the tone that D&D treats wishes as something that should never be taken lightly. Mechanically, the wish spell in 5th edition is explicitly the most powerful and dangerous spell, cautioning that improper use can forever prevent the caster from ever casting it again, the stress of bending reality, a rule that elegantly dissuades abuse. When a 5th edition Efreet grants a wish, the dungeon master is encouraged to carefully interpret it. In one sense, the player's relationship to wishes through genies has always been a small microcosm of D&D's larger theme of player agency versus narrative balance. Dungeon masters often relish the genie encounter because it allows them to flex creative muscle in problem-solving and gentle railroading. Yes, I'll grant your wish. But perhaps not exactly as you intended. Here's an interesting outcome. Over the years, we can see designers alternately giving and taking on this issue. 2nd edition gave dungeon masters a lot of guidance on twisting wishes. 3rd edition tried to rulesify it, but still left much open, and 5th edition strikes a balance by making wish both rare and somewhat self-regulating. If players spam wish for exploits, consequences ensue. Another theme is the alien morality of elementals. Genies are not human. They have grand lifespans, different values. A Dao might find beauty only in gemstones and consider altruism absurd. A Marid might think in centuries-long tales. D&D often uses genies to explore cultural relativity and the idea of powerful outsiders with their own codes. In Al-Qadim, for example, genies follow the law of the elements, an intricate etiquette and hierarchy among genie kind that mortals don't automatically know. This means a mortal can offend a noble genie without realizing or conversely gain favor by treating them in a way they respect, like addressing the Padishah by her full 20-word title. Mechanically, this might come into play with something like a charisma persuasion check having disadvantage if the party doesn't follow genie protocol. Planescape 2 portrayed Archomentals as inscrutable. Jann, heir princess of good, is described as whimsical and mercurial. She might help heroes against evil, but if they bore her or break a promise, she's just as likely to drop them from her floating palace. The mechanical manifestations are subtle, perhaps reaction tables or random behavior charts in older editions, or in 5th edition simply the dungeon master's role-playing guided by lore. But the takeaway is that dealing with genies is often not straightforward. a theme that echoes the source literature like the 1001 Nights, where every genie encounter is a puzzle or a test established in terms of mechanical evolution. Early on, as we saw, genies were tough but not overly complex monsters. The OD&D Genie had a handful of abilities, basically a strong flyer with invisibility. As editions advanced, genies accrued more abilities. By second edition, an Efreet had several spell-like powers, invisibility, polymorph, create illusions, etc., making them more versatile foes or allies. This trend peaked around 3rd edition/3.5, where genies had long stat blocks and could do many things. A 3.5 Efreet could, per day, go gaseous, turn invisible, enlarge, detect magic, create illusion, and, yes, grant 3 wishes. This allowed them to be used in diverse ways. An Efreet could be a brute in combat or a master of trickery as needed. 4th edition, with its design ethos of tight rolls, pared this down and made, say, an Efreet all about setting things on fire in combat and teleporting. Some nuance was lost from a roleplay perspective, less inherent illusion or polymorph, but it made battles dynamic and cinematic. Efreet in 4th edition would, for example, explode in flame when bloodied. Now, 5th edition has something of a compromise. Genies have a handful of at-will powers, phenomena like creating food or drink, tongues for communication, etc., and a few major spells per day, invisibility, plane shift for travel. They're streamlined but still carry signature abilities. One can observe the mechanical priorities of each era. 2nd edition loved providing rich flavor abilities. Even if not all used in combat, they made the creature feel magical. 3rd edition loved comprehensive rule symmetry, genies as outsiders with list of spell-likes at certain caster levels. 4th edition prioritized distinct tactical behaviors, and 5th edition emphasizes playability, easy-to-run stat blocks, while keeping iconic traits. Mechanically, another aspect is genies as non-player character patrons or adversaries in social encounters. In many ways, a genie in a D&D story functions almost like a minor deity or powerful non-player character. Adventures often require diplomacy or deceit rather than sword swings to defeat a genie scenario. From 1st edition's Pharaoh module, where players need to outwit a genie oracle, to 5th edition's Candlekeep Mysteries, where one adventure has a mischievous air genie testing the party's wits, these encounters rely on dungeon master adjudication and skill challenges more than raw combat. D&D's rules, especially in 5th edition, give some scaffolding. For example, social interaction rules, where a creature's attitude, hostile, indifferent, friendly, can be temporarily shifted by successful checks, but ultimately dungeon masters are empowered to play genies as cunning and complex as they like. So mechanically, genies often bypass the usual combat routine entirely, making them memorable to players as something other than just another monster. They occupy a niche similar to dragons in that regard, intelligent, with their own goals, possibly too powerful to just kill, especially if the party is low level. So, alternative approaches are needed. An analysis of combat mechanics specifically. Genie fights can be quite swingy because of genie magic. A genie might start combat by turning invisible, making it a cat-and-mouse game, or summoning a whirlwind to scatter the party, environmental hazard. An Efreet often opens with wall of fire or just bombards from flying position. They can fly and many player characters can't. This asymmetry can challenge parties to think creatively or use magic of their own to level the field. Over the editions, the designers have had to consider balance. For instance, a genie's innate plane shift ability, extremely useful for escape or travel, might be used to let a genie retreat, which is cool narratively but could frustrate players. Our quarry vanished. 5th edition addresses some of this by saying, for example, an Efreet's plane shift can only affect itself and willing creatures, meaning it can't banish a player, no saving throw, you're sent to the plane of fire move, which older dungeon master might have done as a nasty trick. But it can flee or reposition. That's a mechanical decision to avoid unfun outcomes. Similarly, older genies could cast illusion at will to a sometimes abusive degree. A Dao could theoretically just keep throwing out illusory duplicates of itself, not fun to adjudicate 10 rounds later. Now, 5th edition simplifies illusions or limits them to once per day, focusing more on definitively useful abilities. Narrative utility of genies is very high, arguably more than many monsters. They serve as exposition devices. I, a centuries-old married, will tell you the tale of the fall of the Sea Lords as I saw it happen. Quest givers. A noble Genie might hire adventurers to recover a stolen treasure from a dragon's hoard. Too much trouble for the Genie to get himself, but worth outsourcing. Or even comic relief in serious campaigns. A bored Efreet in disguise might travel with the party for a time, getting into humorous situations like a fish-out-of-water story. Elemental Lords, being more remote, are generally less used directly in narrative except at epic climaxes, but their cults and artifacts drive many stories. The Temple of Elemental Evil's moat of mystery around the Elder Elemental Eye captivated players precisely because it hinted at something bigger, Tharizdun, and unleashed tangible threats, the elemental nodes and prince avatars. In 5th edition's Out of the Abyss adventure, there's a side plot where adventurers can gain an audience with Jann, good princess of air, to request aid against the demons, a fine example of using an elemental lord as a deus ex machina or ally, presenting them almost like a demigod who can tip the scales if petitioned correctly. Artistically and aesthetically, analyzing the depiction of genies gives insight into D&D's evolving art direction. Early AD&D art, by Dave Trampier, etc., often depicted genies with a strong Arabian Nights influence, turbans, scimitars, and sometimes comedic elements like a bulbous, muscular upper body trailing into a vortex, the stereotypical genie coming out of a lamp pose. Later, especially in 3rd edition and 4th edition, the art leaned into the elemental aspect. Efreet became more demonic and fiery, Djinn more ethereal and cloud-like. The Al-Qadim line's art by Carl Waller and others merged both. Their genies wear exquisite quasi-Persian fashions and manifest elemental traits. For example, a Dao might have rocky skin, or a Marid's lower half dissolves into water foam. The 5th edition art likely strikes most as the most polished, but it also intentionally harkens to classic imagery. The 5th edition Efreet on page 145 of Monster Manual has horns, yes, but also a sash and jewelry reminiscent of a sultan. This balance in imagery supports the two-sided nature of genies, cultured persons and elemental forces. Meanwhile, Elemental Lords seldom got illustrations until later Dragons and 5th edition. Imix got depicted variously as a silhouette of flame with burning eyes, or a more creature-like flaming ogre. Ogrémoch's portrayal stabilized as a hulking, craggy monstrosity. The 5th edition art, for instance, shows him with a single glaring eye of green crystal. These visual choices often emphasize the inhumanity of Archomentals versus the relatable anthropomorphism of genies. That draws a line. Genies can be negotiated with. Archomentals, especially evil ones, are so alien and immense in power, they are more akin to cataclysms than characters. It's a thematic device. Players might reason with a Marid, but against Olhydra they likely must find a way to banish or bind the unbridled wave of destruction. The reception of genies in D&D fan circles has almost always been positive. They rank among iconic monsters like dragons, beholders, vampires, etc., likely because they provide something unique, a blend of roleplay, combat, mystery, and reward. A dragon might guard treasure, a genie might be the treasure. Imagine finding a lamp that actually houses a genie, that's essentially getting a non-player character ally if treated right. This leads to mechanical ramifications in campaign play. A dungeon master who gives the party a lamp with a bound genie is effectively handing them a multi-use tool. Create food and water daily, scout invisibly, maybe use a whirlwind in a pinch, and at last resort a wish. That's a significant boon, and handling it is a dungeon master art. The dungeon master might impose personality, the genie will only help if persuaded each time, or it has its own agenda ticking. This interplay of narrative boon versus mechanical boon is rarely as foregrounded with other monsters. Finally, a bit on cultural impact within the game mechanics. In the past decade, WotC has been mindful about cultural sensitivity. The portrayal of Zakhara's genies, originally steeped in faux Arabian extravagance, harem outfits, etc., has been subtly updated. The thematic core, opulence, pride, hospitality, and betrayal, remains, but problematic elements, like calling a genie a slave of the lamp, are used thoughtfully to avoid endorsing real-world slavery. In 5th edition's text, genie slavery is clearly framed as an evil act, either by the genie or inflicted on the genie. Mechanically, 5th edition removed the idea that some genies automatically chain their prisoners. For example, 2nd edition texts said a captured Efreet might force you into servitude for 1001 days. 5th edition doesn't assume that, leaving it as one possible outcome depending on the story and genie's temperament. This slight shift affects gameplay by making encounters more open-ended rather than presumptively leading to that trope. In summary, the thematic and mechanical dance of genies and elemental lords in D&D is one of balance, balancing freedom and control, player desire and cautionary tale, combat and parley. They are tools for dungeon masters to challenge not just the party's stats, but their wisdom and teamwork. A group that might brute force many dungeons could find themselves outwitted by a devious genie, a delightful change of pace. Over the editions, as rules have come and gone, genies adapted, but always served as a catalyst for memorable moments, the kind players talk about years later. Remember when we got 3 wishes and accidentally turned the villain into an invincible toad? Or, I'll never forget convincing that Dao to duel the Efreet while we escaped. In a game ultimately about epic heroes, genies stand as both aid and test, and elemental lords as both end bosses and cosmic fixtures, enduring symbols of D&D's blend of the mythical and the playful. Cultural impact. From their inception, D&D's genies and elemental lords have left a mark not only on the game itself, but on the broader tapestry of fantasy media and fan culture. One could argue that they helped introduce a generation of Western fantasy enthusiasts to Middle Eastern folklore elements, weaving them seamlessly into the Eurocentric fantasy that dominated early RPGs. The inclusion of Djinn and Efreet in the 1970s Monster Manual meant that a D&D campaign was just as likely to feature a scene out of Arabian Nights as one out of The Lord of the Rings. This blending of mythic traditions was relatively novel at the time and contributed to the game's eclectic global feel. In an era when popular fantasy was largely inspired by European mythology, D&D presented, through genies, a gateway to stories of Aladdin, Suleiman, and Sinbad, albeit filtered through the lens of Gygaxian dungeon crawling. As D&D grew, so did the portrayal of genies influence or reflect cultural attitudes. The Al-Qadim setting in the early 90s is a case study. Created during a time TSR was experimenting with non-Western settings, like Karatur for Asian-inspired and Maztica for Mesoamerican-inspired, Al-Qadim was an earnest attempt to craft a respectful yet fantastical Arabian setting. In it, genies were not only monsters but part of the social fabric, much as Djinn are in Middle Eastern lore, simultaneously feared and respected. The setting's positive reception among fans, it's remembered fondly for its lush world-building, indicated a desire for more diverse cultural content in fantasy. However, it also existed in a time before widespread conversations about cultural appropriation. Thus, while much of Al-Qadim is handled well, some tropes, like genies casually in harems, or the ubiquitous evil sorcerer binding genies, were stereotypical. In modern times, creators and fans look back and consider how to update these. Wizards of the Coast's recent offerings, like Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel 2022, show a deliberate shift. They include culturally grounded adventures created by authors from those cultures. If an official Middle Eastern-inspired setting were revisited, one can expect that Genie lore would be presented through a more authentic and sensitive lens, emphasizing the rich philosophical and spiritual context of Djinn stories and avoiding reductive clichés. Already in 5th edition, we see less of the word harem and more neutral terms like courts or retinues for genie entourages. In terms of public figures in D&D fandom, genies have had a subtle presence. For example, the legendary artist Tony Di, when illustrating Planescape, gave genies and elemental lords distinctive looks that have influenced fan depictions for years. Di-Lizzie's art for Dragon magazine showing the Prince Imix as a monstrous flame being is still cited. The Elemental Evil storyline in 5th edition, with Princes of the Apocalypse, had cross-promotional material. Gale Force 9 produced an Imix resin miniature a foot tall for collectors, which became a sought-after set piece. This indicates that Archomentals achieved a certain prominence. Companies bet that fans would want to physically represent these on their tables or shelves. On a humorous note, Order of the Stick, a popular webcomic, once joked about rules lawyering a genie into giving infinite wishes, a wink at D&D's own cultural meme about players inevitably trying to get more wishes despite Dungeon Master's admonitions. The influence extends beyond the tabletop. Video games with fantasy themes often have clear analogues to D&D genies, partly because many early RPG developers were D&D fans. Final Fantasy, as mentioned, introduced Efreet as a fire elemental summon as early as 1988. Efreet in Final Fantasy breathes fire and is visually akin to an Efreeti, huge, muscular, horned. While Efreet is drawn from Islamic folklore via D&D's popularization, it's become a staple in Japanese RPGs, meaning D&D's genie interpretation indirectly shaped an aspect of global pop culture. The concept of capturing or summoning genies was possibly an antecedent to the Pokémon concept of capturing elemental creatures. Indeed, one of the early Pokémon, genie-inspired Hoopa, is essentially a genie that can create portals and loves mischief, echoing D&D-like behavior. In literature and film, it's a bit more diffuse, but one could argue that modern fantasy novels featuring Djinn, such as The Golem and the Genie by Helene Wecker or Throne of the Crescent Moon by Saladin Ahmed, benefit from an audience already primed to accept genies as serious fantasy elements, not just children's fairy tale fodder. D&D didn't do that alone, of course, but it contributed. The image of the city of brass afloat on a lake of flame is now one of those iconic fantasy locales that many creators nod to. Even the role-playing text in the Cook and Becker fine art print describing that scene highlights how ingrained it is as a pinnacle of adventure. In the same breath as fighting a red dragon or exploring a lich's tomb, battling an Efreet amid the city of brass stands out as a genre-defining experience. On the flip side, Genie lore within D&D has also responded to real-world cultural discussions. As players from diverse backgrounds enter the hobby, some have re-examined how creatures like genies, which draw on cultures that might be their own heritage, are portrayed. This has led to rich, fan-driven content, such as reimagining genies with more nuance or integrating authentic folklore, like the variety of Djinn, Marid, Efreet, Ghoul, Silat, from Arabic tradition beyond D&D's usage. The Candlekeep forums and various subreddits have threads where people share how they introduced more layers to genie society in their games, perhaps incorporating concepts like Djinn being made of smokeless fire from Islamic texts, or the idea that every genie has a sigil of true name granting power over it from myth. This cross-pollination of genuine folklore detail back into D&D enriches the game's cultural texture. Wizards has sometimes folded in these ideas, as seen with the Tasha's Cauldron Genie Warlock. One of the sample patrons mentioned is a noble genie named Nasser, which is Arabic for advisor, an effort to use authentic-sounding nomenclature, conventions and cosplay. While it's more niche, you do see genie characters in D&D cosplay at events, often an Efreeti with body paint and horns, or a more humorous approach, like someone dressed as a genie coming out of a D&D prop lamp. It's testament to their recognizability. Many players have fond memories of a genie encounter, and it becomes a war story in gaming circles. Our dungeon master had an Efreet in his campaign that nearly TPK'd us with a single wish reversal. Or, we still joke that our party's bard is stuck married to a princess of the Marids due to a wish gone wrong. One cannot ignore the broader shift in how fantasy addresses non-Western sources. Early D&D often exoticized such elements. Genies were exotic, the other, something encountered in a faraway desert. Modern fantasy, D&D included, strives, or at least aspires, to integrate these elements not as exotic set pieces, but as part of a lived-in world with their own agency. The cultural impact of genies in D&D thereby includes being a vector through which the hobby has examined its own approach to diversity and representation. For instance, some Middle Eastern gamers have written blog posts and forum comments about how they incorporate Djinn from their cultural perspective into D&D, sometimes critiquing or adjusting the official versions. This dialogue is part of D&D's evolving culture. Finally, D&D genies have been used in educational or comparative contexts. In discussions about mythology, or even in classrooms, teachers have occasionally used D&D monster manuals to engage students with mythic archetypes. A teacher might show how D&D's Genie compares with descriptions from the Arabian Nights, prompting analysis of adaptation and interpretation. In this way, D&D's Genie is a cultural artifact of its own, a remix of folklore that can be studied and appreciated both as pop culture and as a gateway to deeper exploration of original sources. In sum, the cultural impact of D&D's Genies and Elemental Lords is multifaceted. They have influenced fantasy art, gaming tropes, and the inclusion of Middle Eastern myth in modern fantasy. They have spurred internal growth within the community towards more nuanced portrayals and have left echoes in various media, from video games summoning Efreets to novels where a bound genie might owe more to D&D's Efreet than to folklores. The enduring image of adventurers confronting a towering Efreet with the city of brass in the background has become part of the common language of epic fantasy. And as culture shifts, these creatures shift with it, continuing to enthrall and invite reflection in equal measure. In the present day, Genies and Elemental Lords stand as fully realized components of D&D's vast multiverse. Campaigns currently being played in 2025 might feature, say, a married diplomat at the council in Baldur's Gate, negotiating trade rights for coral and pearls, or a cult of Imix causing wildfires in the north that heroes must extinguish. The Forgotten Realms' ongoing meta-story has not spotlighted genies heavily since the elemental evil events of 2015, but these beings continue to appear in ancillary products and organized play. In the latest season of D&D Adventurers League, for example, a hypothetical Season 12 set in Calimshan, one could easily imagine a module where players must arbitrate a dispute between a freed Genie and the local Kalishite Pasha, reflecting the law that Genie emancipation has been a recent upheaval in that region. The tools to run such scenarios are firmly in place in 5th edition's core books. Looking to the announced future, D&D is on the cusp of its 50th anniversary release of new core rulebooks, 1D&D. While these are touted as backward compatible, an evolution of 5th edition rather than a whole new edition, they promise to update presentation and possibly incorporate fan feedback gathered over a decade. For Genies, this could mean a few things. We anticipate expanded lore sidebars in the monster manual, perhaps giving more insight into Genie society and behavior, essentially officially canonizing some of the rich details that have previously only been in setting-specific books or left to inference. There might be a sidebar on Genie courts of the inner planes that describes the Great Khan, Padishah, etc., giving dungeon masters ready plot seeds. The Great Caliph of the Djinn, now based in a palatial cloud fortress above Zakara, sometimes sends Djinn emissaries to other worlds, seeking rare alchemical components. These could be patrons or rivals to adventurers. Such a snippet could be invaluable for sparking ideas. Similarly, for Elemental Lords, perhaps a summary of the princes of elemental good will be provided so that it's not only the evil ones players know of, Zaman Rule and his rebellion against Imix, etc., which was great Dragon magazine material that many newer players haven't seen. On the rules mechanics side, 1D&D might adjust challenge ratings or abilities of genies for balance. For instance, the current CR of an Efreet 11 might be nudged if they feel it doesn't reflect its true difficulty. Some dungeon masters note Efreet can be easier than expected if players exploit their limited spell repertoire. A redesign might grant Efreet a rechargeable flame burst or something to keep pace in a prolonged fight. They might also integrate genies more into the Dungeon Master's Guide encounter building guidelines, possibly as examples of negotiation encounters, with guidance on how to run a social scene with a powerful non-player character. This aligns with WotC's aim to make dungeon mastering more accessible. Genies are a prime example of monsters that are as much non-player characters as foes. The future storylines teased by WotC also could bring genies back to the forefront. There are hints that after revisiting classic themes, like dragons in Fizban's Treasury or giants in Glory of the Giants, they might do a deep dive into the inner planes next. If an elemental codex or such is ever released, it would almost certainly detail genie factions, new genie variants, maybe stat blocks for noble genies like the Caliph of the Djinn, who would be a step above a normal genie in power, and potentially an adventure path that centers on genie politics or an elemental war. The success of streaming shows like Critical Role, which for instance had a whole arc in Campaign 2 involving a fire elemental forge and a pact with a being resembling an elemental lord, shows audience appetite for planar and genie content is there. Another factor is the ongoing multimedia expansion, with a D&D TV series in development and possibly more movies. Who knows? We might see a genie character on screen in the next few years, which would further elevate their profile. If the series, say, features an episode where the party deals with an Efreet in the City of Brass, that depiction could become canonized in a sourcebook, much like the comic relief characters from the 80s cartoon got statted back then. Wizards, now under Hasbro's eye for transmedia synergy, might align a product release with such media. Imagine a scenario where, if a D&D show has a popular genie character, WotC might publish Tales from the City of Brass as an adventure compilation. In the community right now, one notable future element is homebrew and third-party content continuing to enrich Genie lore. Kickstarters for planar adventures often include Genie encounters. Kobold Press's Empire of the Ghouls, 2020, included a detour to an elemental plane with genie-like entities. The upcoming Planescape, 2023, likely touches on the City of Brass, as it historically did. Fans on Dungeon Masters Guild have created supplements like 20 New Wishes and Their Ironies, indicating that even after decades people are still intrigued by the concept of twisting wishes. All these show an ongoing engagement that will carry into one D&D era. The designers' comments in recent interviews, like Jeremy Crawford's Dragon Talk podcasts, hint that they consider Genies iconic D&D monsters on par with, say, Yugoloths or Mind Flayers. As such, they'll remain in the baseline. We don't foresee any radical changes, like removing their wish power or altering alignments drastically, because 5th edition's philosophy has been to embrace classic identity. What we do foresee is maybe more clarity. For example, one D&D might clarify how many times ever an Efreet can grant wishes for the same person, or set easier guidelines for adjudicating them to help newer dungeon masteries. Another prospective tweak, making the noble genies, the named rulers, into actual statted, legendary creatures. This would align with how 5th edition has given us big-named foes like Orcus or Zariel with full stats. Perhaps we will see, say, a stat block for Prince of Evil Fire, Imix in a future Book of Fiends or similar, making it easier to include these arch-villains at level 20 play without having to do heavy conversions from old materials. In playtests or UA, if such appears, that will signal strong support for including Elemental Lords in high-level play, and 5th edition bar 1 D&D is definitely trying to improve the high-level experience, commonly an area of weakness in D&D's past. Another near-future piece is the digital D&D Beyond integration. Since WotC acquired D&D Beyond, they've been updating entries and adding lore blurbs. The Genie entries on D&D Beyond might get expanded or linked to new Planescape gazetteers, etc. Perhaps interactive maps of the planes with points of interest like City of Brass, ruled by the Grand Sultan, Sea Monster Manual page whatever, will become a tool. Lastly, the future will likely see Genies maintain their dual role in D&D's identity, as both fantastical beings of story and mechanical engines of chaos, the wish economy, etc. Dungeon Masters will continue to use Genies to challenge not just swords, but also minds and morals of players. With the trend in 5th edition adventures towards morally grey and complex situations, Genies fit perfectly. They are not innately demons or angels, they are self-interested and can be reasoned with. This nuance resonates with modern storytelling. So I suspect we might get an official adventure down the line akin to an anthology of Genie tales, perhaps something like an Adventurer's Chronicle, Genies of the Multiverse, that collects various planar one-shots featuring Genie encounters, similar to Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel concept but elemental-themed. There's currently no direct announcement of that, but thematically it would make sense after the Planescape release rekindles interest in planar adventuring. In conclusion, as D&D stands in 2025, Genies and Elemental Lords are firmly ingrained in the game's present and poised to flourish in its future. They exemplify the game's blend of the mythic and the strategic. Announced developments suggest an affirmation of their classic traits, and likely an expansion in terms of lore depth and mechanical support. Whether players will be wheeling and dealing with an eccentric Genie on the streets of Waterdeep, or staving off the apocalypse by thwarting Tharizdun's fiery, strange siblings, Imix and company, it's clear that these elemental powers will continue to be at the heart of many epic D&D sagas to come, their tales as eternal as the elements themselves. From their earliest glimmers in D&D's formative days to the multi-planar epics of the modern game, Genies and Elemental Lords have proven to be enduring and multifaceted figures in the tapestry of fantasy role-playing. Chronologically tracing their journey illuminates not only an evolution of game design, but also a conversation between myth and imagination spanning 5 decades. In the beginning, we saw how Gygax and Arneson's nascent fantasy world drew upon the deep well of folklore. The Djinn and Efreet of OD&D stepped out of ancient tales into dice and paper adventures, bringing with them the allure of wishes and the perils of hubris. These first genies were sketched with broad strokes, mighty, capricious, and distinctly not of the mundane world, and yet they captured the players' minds. The image of an Efreet towering over adventurers amid the city of brass, as immortalized on the AD&D First Edition Dungeon Master's Guide cover, became an icon of the game itself. It symbolized D&D's promise. Here be endless wonder, challenge, and story. As AD&D unfolded, Genies expanded from singular entities into a family of elemental kinch. We met the haughty Tao in their gem-strewn caverns, the majestic Marids ruling coral palaces under the sea, and the humble yet proud Jann roaming deserts as nomads. Game lore wove these beings into the fabric of campaign settings. In Greyhawk and Forgotten Realms, ancient wars and golden ages were attributed to Genie interference. From Calimshan's Scorched Sand, a legacy of a 1,000-year Djinn-Efreet conflict, to the Temple of Elemental Evil's lurking menace, Imix and his brethren awaiting release. At the table, players learned that a Genie could be friend or foe, and often both. An Efreet might share a goblet of fiery wine with you one moment, and offended by a careless word, hurl you into a portal the next. Elemental Lords, first introduced as malevolent demon princes of the elements, likewise became seminal villains, reminding us that even the raw elements had personified extremes that could threaten the balance of worlds. Across Second Edition, we observed a flowering of detail and nuance. The Genie became not just a monster to fight, but a non-player character with culture, duties, and even a touch of humor or pathos. Who can forget the whimsical courtly intrigues of Zakara's Genie nobility, where a proud Genie vizier might match wits with a clever mortal, or a melancholic Marid recount endless tragedies in flowery verse. In Planescape, sages in Sigil's City of Doors bartered with Tao traders and pondered the cosmic significance of elemental warfare, placing Genies and Archomentals in a grand philosophical tableau of law versus chaos. This era reinforced an important lesson. Genies were personalities. They could carry narratives. A Genie could be a quest giver, the Marid who tasks heroes with retrieving the Pearl of 10,000 Years from a kraken's nest, or a quest object, the classic rescue the Genie from the evil wizard's bottle trope. The game, through these tales, paid homage to the source myths while building its own legendary canon. Names like Great Khan Cabril or Princess Chan became as evocative in D&D lore as Zeus or Odin in real-world myth. With third and fourth editions, the pendulum of design swung, but the Genies remained pivotal. Third edition's mechanical rigor armed Genies with concrete powers and rules, making them simultaneously more accessible to dungeon masters and ripe for exploitation by tactically savvy players. The notorious Efreet Infinite Wish exploits remain a cautionary tale in RPG forums. Yet these mechanics also allowed Genies to be integrated into the very strategy of a campaign. Summoning a Dao for a wish became as viable, if dangerous, as slaying a dragon for its hoard. In 4th edition, the primordials took center stage as near-gods of the elemental chaos, giving the Elemental Lords a new origin myth and context. They became the ancient antagonists of creation itself. Genies, correspondingly, were recast slightly more as elemental combatants or envoys, but crucially, 4th edition's narrative framework kept their individualism alive. The City of Brass in 4th edition was as bustling and intrigue-laden as ever. Its depiction as a thriving metropolis of tyrannical Efreet and enslaved souls carried forward the legacy of earlier editions, even amid rule changes. Now, in 5th edition, we have a synthesis and celebration of all that came before. Genies in 5th edition feel both mythic and grounded. They appear in hardcover adventures, from the doomed lovers Nadir and Bahamut, a Genie human romance referenced in Tasha's Cauldron, to the proud Baste, an Efreeti warlord in Dungeon of the Mad Mage, showcasing their versatility as story elements. 5th edition also encapsulates the Elemental Lords in an accessible way. Via the Princes of the Apocalypse campaign, any gaming group can tangle with Imix or Olhydra in a saga that calls back to the roots of D&D while standing on its own. Meanwhile, player options like the Genie Patron Warlock let players themselves engage with Genie lore intimately, perhaps forging pacts that echo the tales of Aladdin or Scheherazade. This democratization of Genie lore, from Dungeon Master-only territory into something players can actively participate in shaping, is a milestone in the journey that started with a mere Type Djinn entry in a 1974 pamphlet. And so we conclude by recognizing that the tale of Genies and Elemental Lords in D&D is ultimately a story of expansion and enrichment. Each era did not erase the prior conception, but layered new ideas atop the old. The Genie that first had not the powers credited to them in fairy tales have, by 2025, become characters who transcend those fairy tales. They are members of living societies, schemers in political dramas, and sometimes even player allies, all while still occasionally granting that coveted wish or whisking a foe into a whirlwind. The Elemental Lords, once footnotes in a Fiend folio, are now major villains and even prospective allies woven into campaign arcs across multiple published worlds. The chronicle we've assembled shows that these beings have been, and continue to be, among the game's most potent symbols of wonder. They invite players to imagine beyond the earthly, to stand at a portal and feel the hot wind from the plane of fire as an Efreeti Pasha strides through in gilded armor, or to gaze over an infinite sea next to a melancholy married princess who speaks in ancient poems. They also challenge players to think and feel, to weigh the cost of a wish, to grapple with beings of shifting morality, to outwit the essentially inhuman. In a hobby that is about crafting heroic sagas, Genies and Elemental Lords provide both the extraordinary adversaries that forge heroes and the miraculous boons that reward them. In closing, the journey of Genies and their elemental lieges through D&D's history exemplifies the game's genius for blending the known with the novel. Inspired by world mythology, they became something uniquely D&D, an integral part of its identity and appeal. Today, whether one plays in Greyhawk, the Forgotten Realms, Eberron, or a homebrew cosmos, the influence of these beings is there. They remind us that in Dungeons and Dragons, every element of creation has a story, a face, and a will of its own. The fire burns, the wind blows, the earth endures, the water flows. And in the multiverse of D&D, each of those has a name, a voice, and perhaps a palace waiting just beyond the portal of brass. In the words of an old Zakharan saying, "The noblest treasures and the darkest curses alike carry the mark of a genie's hand." As players and dungeon masters, we continue to open those metaphorical bottles, releasing new stories into our games. And as long as we do, the legacy of genies and elemental lords will continue to shine, bright as the flames of Imix, swift as the winds of Jann, deep as the well of the Padishah's pearls, in the ever-evolving epic that is Dungeons and Dragons. If you enjoyed this deep dive into D&D lore, please consider liking the video and subscribing for more adventures into the realms of Dungeons and Dragons. Until next time, keep rolling those dice, and perhaps our paths will cross again at the crossroads.